Pure evil. 10 people shot and killed at a Buffalo supermarket in a racist rampage.
A military-style execution.
How can shootings like this be stopped? New York Governor Kathy Hochul is next. And fighting spirit. GOP heavyweights split with former President Trump over primaries. While Democrats wonder if their voters will turn out this fall. What issues are motivating them? I'll talk with House Speaker Nancy Pelosi and Republican Governor of Nebraska Pete Ricketts ahead. Plus, on Putin's border, as Ukraine fights, Finland applies to join NATO, exactly what Putin tried to avoid.
You caused this. Look at the mirror.
How will Russia respond? I'll speak exclusively to the president of Finland, Sauli Niinistö, in moments. Good morning, I'm Dana Bash in Washington, where the state of our union is heartbroken and horrified. This morning, we are grieving the loss of 10 people in Buffalo, New York, shot and killed while shopping for groceries. 3 others were shot but survived, victims of a rampage by an 18-year-old white male shooter who authorities say traveled for hours and used an assault-style weapon to carry out the racist attack. 11 of the 13 victims were black. The shooter has pleaded not guilty to first-degree murder in an attack streamed live on social media as the Justice Department examines whether he committed a hate crime and an act of racially motivated violent extremism. President Biden suggested the shooting was domestic terrorism. Investigators are reviewing a 180-page manifesto posted online in connection with the shooting probe, 2 law enforcement officials tell CNN. And the manifesto's author describes his perceptions about the dwindling size of the white population in the U.S. and claims of ethnic and cultural replacement of whites. He describes himself as a fascist, a white supremacist, and an anti-Semite who picked up most of his beliefs on the internet. Here with me now is New York Governor Kathy Hochul. Governor, thank you so much for joining me. I'm sorry it's under these conditions. Can you first tell us what more you've learned about the shooter's motive and this purported manifesto?
Well, this manifesto tells everything to us, and that is what's so bone-chilling about it, is that there is the ability for people to write and subscribe to such philosophies filled with hate, the white supremacist acts of terrorism that are being fomented on social media, and to know that what this one individual did has been shared with the rest of the world, as well as the live streaming of this military-style execution that occurred in the streets of my hometown. And that is what is so fundamentally disturbing about this, that this is not just a long time ago, members of the KKK would sit in a hall and plot what they're going to do in their community. This spreads like a virus, and that's why I'm calling on the CEOs of all the social media platforms to examine their policies and to be able to look me in the eye and tell me that everything is being done that they can to make sure that this information is not spread. They have to be able to identify when information like this, the second it hits the platform, it needs to be taken down, because this is spreading like wildfire. These theories that results in the radicalization of a young person sitting in their house is deeply scary, and it's something that has to be dealt with.
Well, you have called it a, quote, feeding frenzy on social media for white supremacy. We also know that this is based on something that's truly disgusting. It's called replacement theory. The idea is that non-white people living in America are trying to replace white people. And it's being pushed by some prominent right-wing voices. And it's been done so for years. What can be done to stop that?
They need to be called out, and leaders, elected officials from both parties need to stand up at this moment and call it out and to shame it and to make sure that these people crawl back into their holes and stay there. This cannot be part of our mainstream dialogue here in the United States of America. So leaders have a responsibility to call it out, As a leader of the state of New York, I also have a responsibility to make sure that we protect people with respect to guns. And we have some of the toughest laws in America on the books here, but the guns are coming in from other states, or the enhanced magazine, which is exactly what happened here, the high-capacity magazine that led to the slaughter of people in my hometown. So we are dealing with it on the gun side, but also on the social media side. And the combination of the wild access to guns, unfettered, we need national laws to deal with this, as well as the unfettered sharing of hate information on the internet. That is a lethal combination. We saw that on display here just hours ago, yesterday.
Talking about guns, do you know whether the shooter legally obtained and possessed this weapon?
The gun was purchased in a gun store in New York State legally, an AR-15. But what has made this so lethal and so devastating for this community was the high-capacity magazine that would have had to have been purchased elsewhere. That's not legal in the state of New York. We don't know whether it was purchased in Pennsylvania, but literally the Pennsylvania border is minutes away, and there already is the flow of guns and illegal capacity magazines coming from gun shows purchased legally, and they end up in someone's trunk. They bring them up I-81, they head into New York State, head over to the Bronx, head over to Brooklyn, head over to the city, or they go to places like New York, Buffalo, Syracuse, Rochester. So that's how it's spreading. Other states do not have the same laws that we have, and people are just crossing those borders.
Governor Kathy Hochul joining me from your hometown of Buffalo. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Here with me now is the Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi. Madam Speaker, thank you so much for joining me. On the shooting in Buffalo, the racist purported manifesto is based on the really repugnant white supremacist idea that people of color are replacing white people in the United States. And as you know, this isn't just a fringe theory on the corner of the internet. It's being pushed by right-wing media personalities and some political figures. What do you say to them, and do they share any responsibility in this attack?
Well, I do think that it's so horrible, and it's a horrible way to wake up on Sunday for these families to face that reality and to have it be part of a philosophy in our country, as you described. But I do think that some of the people of faith, as well as leaders in sense of community and the rest, not necessarily political people, because that might be dividing, that people have to come out and say that this has no place in our country. We see it with our Asian Pacific American community. We see it in terms of the people from all parts of the Latino community, which is very diverse, and it's just not right. And our chairman, Benny Thompson, for years has been pleading for there to be stronger attention to and objection to any domestic terrorism, and that's what this is, domestic terrorism.
And you know, we've been here so many times before. You and other Democrats call for new gun restrictions year after year. Democrats have unified control of the House and the Senate and the White House. I know that in the House you've repeatedly passed gun measures and that your majorities in Congress are slim. But should you and the President and other Democratic leaders make this a bigger priority?
It is a huge priority for us, and it has been a huge priority for Joe Biden, for President Biden. Time and time again, we have met with survivors, families of survivors. I just did in terms of Mother's Day, because we had moms who had lost their children to gun violence. We honor them at a luncheon in San Francisco. My daughter helped put that together with Maddie Scott, who lost her son to gun violence. But we're doing it year in and year out, and it's grown, sadly, a club no one wants to belong to. But the fact is, the 60-vote majority in the Senate is an obstacle to doing many good things, unfortunately. And again, we are not going away until the job is done. We've said it over and over again to the families of Newtown, the Florida families, the Pulse families. It's not just, though, the main of, these mass murders, which are horrible. They're high profile. It's what happens every single night across the country in our cities and other places in our country. So there has to be, and it's overwhelmingly popular. And people of, members of the NRA, gun owners, hunters, and all the rest, they have to have a background, they have to have the background check. Why shouldn't everyone who wants to have a gun have that? And we'll see. Now, would it solve every challenge we have? Maybe not, but it would take us a long way. And we know when the Brady bill first passed, and I was part of that, that millions of purchases were stopped and lives were saved. So this is about safety, and safety is what we've taken oath to protect and defend the Constitution. The inference to be drawn is the safety also of the American people.
Let's turn to Roe versus Wade. You protested for abortion rights this week on the Capitol steps, but as you know, Roe is still likely to be overturned. And the bill you passed in the House to legalize abortion is not going to become law anytime soon. So what can you do to help women who will be seeking abortions but live in states where it's banned? For example, would you encourage private companies to provide travel for abortions as a health benefit?
Well, of course that, but the fact is we as a country, let's just put this in perspective. What we want women and families and everyone to focus on is the nature of this decision. This is our country, the genius of our founders was to have a constitution that enabled freedom to expand. And it did with marriage equality, it did with Roe v. Wade, in many ways defining freedom more fully. This is the first time the court has taken back a freedom that was defined by precedent and respect for privacy. So let's stay focused on who we are as a country and not turn into something where we have to depend on the privacy. I think that's all good. It's helpful to the women, and that's important. But it's also important to know that this is not right. This is not the path of freedom for our country. So they're putting freedom on the ballot, and our democracy has been on the ballot because of what they are doing to elections. But this is a place where freedom and the kitchen table issues of America's families come together. What are the decisions that a family makes? What about contraception for young people? You know, it's just beyond a particular situation. It's massive in terms of contraception, in vitro fertilization, again, a woman's right to decide. And it's okay. We want to mitigate for the damage, but we have to get rid of the damage.
Many Democrats are angry. I know you're one of them. A lot of people in the grassroots are despondent over this draft ruling. And one reason why they're upset is because conservatives have played the long game here. You know this. They have said over and over for decades that this was their goal, to overturn Roe v. Wade, and that Democratic leaders should have seen this coming. I'm sure you've heard this too.
No, I mean, the point is who would have ever suspected that a creature like Donald Trump would become president of the United States, waiving a list of judges that he would appoint, therefore getting the support of the far right, and appointing those anti-freedom justices to the court. So this is not about long game. We played a long game. We won Roe v. Wade a long time ago. We voted to protect it over time. We have elected a Democratic House of Representatives that is pro-choice. Again, you have 60-vote thing in the Senate, and some lack of clarity on part of some of the Republicans who say they're pro-choice and then vote against a woman's right to choose. But it isn't, let's not take our eye off the ball. The ball is this court, which is dangerous to the freedoms of our country. So, beware in terms of marriage equality, beware in terms of other aspects of it. And so it is, let's not waste our time on that. The fact is, this is a dangerous court to families, to freedom in our country. And that is why people have to mobilize. My saying is, we don't agonize, we organize. We go out there and make sure people know that if actually elections have consequences.
So what
The one
impact
that
will this
elected-
have on the midterms?
What's his name did? Well, I would hope that we could have some resolution of it before. We'd rather have it resolved rather than an issue for a campaign, because we're talking about a woman's decision-making, her family, her God, her doctor, her own decision-making. So we have to fight the fight on the issue now. I think that it would have an impact on the elections, but right now I want everyone to just focus on what this does and what this means to you. Well, and I say this as a practicing devout Catholic, 5 children in 6 years in 1 week. I don't disrespect people's views and how they want to live their lives, but I don't think that it's up to the Donald Trump appointees on the court or any politicians to make that decision for women. And I'll just say what I've been saying for decades. Understand this is not just about terminating a pregnancy. This is about contraception, family planning. They have been against it. They've told me, some of my Republican colleagues, we're not for any family planning domestically or internationally when we've tried to get rid of the gag rule and things like that. So this is as personal as it gets. All politics is local, Tip. This politics is very personal.
Yeah, understandably. And speaking of families, I want to ask about baby formula and the shortage in America. One manufacturer expects the shortages to last for the rest of the year. There are American parents who can't feed their babies right now. So when can parents who need help expect that? For example, Madam Speaker, should the president use the Defense Production Act to manufacture more baby formula?
Yeah, I think so, but as the law is now, it is not possible to do that. Congresswoman Rosa DeLauro, she's the chair of the Appropriations Committee, as you know, she's been on this case for a while. She was the chair of the new Ag Committee, subcommittee on appropriations before, and that's ag, but it's also nutrition and everything that goes with that. So we've been talking about that, and she feels quite certain that we have to change the law in order for the Defense Production Act to be called into play, and we certainly should. But in the meantime, this week we have 2 bills coming out. Bobby Scott, chair of Education and Labor Committee, has a bill to loosen some of the red tape associated with how people can buy formula and other aspects of that. 50% of the formula is purchased under the WIC program, and so to facilitate that, A. B, we then have another bill that Rosa, Madam Chair, is putting together that will allocate resources for us to be able to purchase more, and that is, there are 4 countries, Mexico, Chile, Ireland, and the Netherlands, who have supply that we may be able to acquire immediately. Now, the president has rightfully said we have to be as fast as possible, but as cautious as possible so that we have safety. In addition to all of this, we have to subject these companies to some scrutiny about the safety of this and how we got to a place where we have babies crying in our country because they're hungry and the shelves are bare. We have to fill them immediately.
Real quick.
I say that as a mother of 5.
Yeah.
Grandmother of 9.
Understandably. Before I let you go, one more thing on the plate of Congress is the coronavirus relief package. The Senate didn't pass it because Republicans want to attach immigration to it, keeping a pandemic border rule called Title 42. Some Senate Democrats are now signaling, well, they're open to passing both of those together. Real quick, yes or no, would you support that?
Well, listen, we're observing in these days 1 million people who have died of COVID. The sadness of this lingers on, causing all kinds of trauma for families, mental health issues, sadness for families. You would think that the Republicans would take that into consideration. They couldn't pass the Ukraine bill with the senators going over to Ukraine empty-handed with a promise. We passed the bill. We wanted to put COVID on there. They said no. We said, okay, Ukraine, urgent, right this minute, we'll do that. but we have to do the COVID package. There's no use holding it up to blackmail as the Republicans are trying to do. We're working on it. We'll find a way. It has to be done because people continuing to hear every moment, all the time. Now, hopefully not as deadly as the previous COVID-19, but nonetheless, we must pass the package. And
even if it
again,
means Title 42
they
is
should
on
not connect it. I don't know why 42 would be on it. It has nothing to do with it.
Okay.
But nonetheless, I think Title 42, the president made the right decision. The fact is now that we have to either substitute for it, but we must pass the
Madam
COVID
Speaker,
package.
I have to let you go. Thank you so much for joining me this morning. I appreciate it. My next guest backed a different candidate than former President Trump in his state's Republican primary this week, and the governor won. I'll ask Nebraska Governor Pete Ricketts about the future of his party next, and Finland will apply to join NATO, and it appears that Russia is already retaliating. I'll talk exclusively to the Finnish president on why the dramatic change. That's coming up. Welcome back to State of the Union. Former President Trump is looking at this spring's primary races as a test of his power over his party. But Trump suffered his first loss this past week when the candidate he backed to replace Nebraska Governor Pete Ricketts lost to the candidate Ricketts endorsed to replace him. And now a host of GOP heavyweights, including Trump's own former vice president, are hoping to pull the same thing off again in Georgia. Here with me now to discuss is Nebraska Governor Pete Ricketts, who's also co-chair of the Republican Governors Association. Thank you for joining me, Governor. I'm going to get to that in a moment, but first I want to ask about the shooting in Buffalo yesterday. The shooter's purported manifesto centers on white supremacist nationalism and the idea that non-white immigrants are replacing white people in the U.S. And frankly, a lot of this has been perpetuated by some right-wing media and even some political figures. So as a GOP elected official and a leader in your party, can you offer some moral clarity here about these views and the people who espouse them?
Yeah, absolutely. Racism has no place in America. And of course, we grieve for the victims and keep them in our thoughts and prayers. And this is where the FBI does need to investigate. If it was racially motivated, it needs to be a hate crime and prosecuted that way on top of the murders. And we really need to send a strong message that this is just anti-American, that if you are pursuing these kind of goals, this is not a place for you. You need to go someplace else because that's not what this country is about.
I want to ask a question about guns. New York Governor Kathy Hochul told me at the beginning of this program that the shooter obtained this weapon legally. He's just 18 years old. There is a bipartisan bill in Congress to raise the minimum age to buy an assault-style weapon to 21. Do you support that?
I haven't looked at the details of that bill. I think when we're talking about events like this, one of the things that we ought to be doing is what we've kind of done here in Nebraska is work to be able to open up good lines of communications between educators, law enforcement, behavioral health specialists to try and be more preventative. We launched our system of care here in Nebraska back in 2016 to be more preventative, specifically around mental health issues in children. And that's one of the things I think we can all focus on. There was a study last year that showed that these shooters have a lot of mental health issues, and that's one of the things that I think we can do more on. And in fact, in Nebraska, we're dedicating millions of dollars to try and attract more people to the behavioral health field because we've got such a shortage.
And is there any gun legislation to put tighter controls or new age limits, even on the state level? It's only 18 in your state as well.
Yeah, we don't have any restrictions like that. And again, I think the focus ought to be on trying to be preventive rather than to restrict legal buying from people. It really needs to be focused on what is the issue here with each individual and trying to find how we can be more proactive in spotting those folks and getting them the help they need.
All right, Governor, let's talk about the Republican Party. The candidate you endorsed to replace you just defeated the candidate that former President Trump endorsed in your state's Republican primary. Does this show that there are limits to the power of the Trump endorsement?
Well, here in Nebraska, the candidate that President Trump endorsed was a deeply flawed candidate, had a number of different scandals around him. It's one of the reasons why I picked one of his opponents. You know, in a contested primary, we ought to expect that the Republicans are going to be different sides of this. It's not unusual. I support many of President Trump's policies, but in this case, we are on opposite sides of it. And at the end of the day, I think voters in individual states, and it's certainly true here in Nebraska, they make their own decisions. You know, people outside the state can have an influence, but at the end of the day, Nebraskans look to their own, and Nebraskans made the decision they wanted for their state.
This isn't just about Nebraska. You're going to travel to Georgia this week, just like Chris Christie and Mike Pence are, to campaign for Governor Brian Kemp. He's running again against a Trump-endorsed challenger, that being David Perdue. I think it's fair to say there are a few Republicans who Donald Trump dislikes more than Brian Kemp after that governor refused to overturn the 2020 election. Would it be easier, your job as a co-chair of the Republican Governors Association, if President Trump just stayed out of these primaries?
Well, I try to focus on the things I can control, and what President Trump does is not one of those things. You know, as co-chair of the Republican Governors Association, we've been very clear that we support our incumbents. Brian Kemp is a great incumbent. He's done a fantastic job in Georgia. We're excited to support him, and that's one of the reasons why I'm going to Georgia, because I think Brian Kemp deserves another term. and I think he's going to be able to beat Tracy Abrams. So this is a man who's done a great job, and he deserves to be reelected.
You can't control him. So is it true that you asked the president, the former president, to stay out of the primary in your home state of Nebraska, and he refused?
Yeah, he at the time he didn't refuse. He said he'd get back to me later. But yes, I did call him last summer and asked him to stay out of the primary race. But I guess that's a great example of things you can control and things you can't control.
And the former president just announced he's endorsing Doug Mastriano in the Pennsylvania governor's race. He was a key player in trying to overturn the 2020 election in Pennsylvania in that legislature. Party leaders there worry he can't win the general election. As the co-chair of the RGA, would you support him if he's the nominee?
So we support the people that the Republican nominees that the people of those states elect. We make those decisions based on where we think we can be effective. Our policy has long been we get involved in races where we think we can win. So that candidate, whoever gets elected in Pennsylvania, will have to show that they're going to make it a good race. And if it's a good race, the Republican Governors Association will be there to support our Republican nominee.
That's not a ringing endorsement.
Well, again, I'm not familiar specifically with all the candidates in Pennsylvania. Where we have an open seat like that, the Republican Governors Association doesn't get involved. So we wait till the people of that state pick their nominee. And then, of course, we decide on which races we can be effective in. And that's where we allocate our resources.
How do you see former President Trump right now? Is he the leader of the GOP?
I would think one of the things I think there's a lot of misconception about just generally is that there's some, big monolithic thing called the Republican Party. It's very decentralized. Certainly President Trump, has a very big influence on the Republican Party. Again, I get back to supporting his policies. They were fantastic when he was in office. You could see the results in the economy, the reduction in income inequality, reduction in, African American unemployment, Asian American unemployment, just how many people were working in our workforce. So great policies that helped out our country. And I think that continues to have an influence in Republicans because the policies that he was putting in place were ones broadly Republican support. So I think that without a Republican president, there's a lot of different leaders. President Trump certainly has a lot of influence because his policies were so good.
Before I let you go, one final question about Roe v. Wade. The Supreme Court appears poised to reverse that. Nebraska, your state, does not have a so-called trigger law on the books, but there was an effort, as you know, to pass one. It failed by only 2 votes last month. The abortion ban that you tried to pass did not include any exceptions for rape or incest. So can you clarify, do you think that the state of Nebraska should require a young girl who was raped to carry that pregnancy to term?
So Nebraska is a pro-life state. I believe life begins at conception, and those are babies too. So if Roe versus Wade, which was a horrible constitutional decision, gets overturned by the Supreme Court, which we're hopeful of, here in Nebraska, we're going to take further steps to protect those preborn babies.
Including in the case of rape or incest?
They're still babies too, yes, they're still babies.
So if Roe is overruled and overturned, will you call a special session right away to ban abortion in Nebraska?
Well, if we do get that Roe versus Wade overturned, I will work with our Speaker of the Legislature to work on a special session and do more to protect preborn babies. We'll have to wait and see what that decision is before we can take further steps, but that would certainly be my intention.
Okay, Governor Ricketts, thank you so much for joining me. I appreciate it.
Great, thanks for having me on.
And Finland is applying to join NATO. How will that reshape the world order and affect Russia's ambitions? The Finnish president joins me next. Welcome back to State of the Union. This morning, Finland formally moved to join NATO and set aside decades of neutrality. The decision, the country's president told Vladimir Putin on a call this weekend, was a direct result of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. NATO expansion along Russia's western border is the exact opposite of what Putin said he was trying to accomplish with the war. And he told Finland's president this weekend that he was making a mistake. Here with me now, the president of Finland, Sauli Niinistö. Mr. President, thank you so much for joining me again. And just days before Russia invaded Ukraine, we spoke, and you told me you did not see any reason for, quote, dramatic, sudden changes to Finland's relationship with NATO. Here we are just 3 months later, and you've just announced you're going to formally apply to join the NATO alliance. Is this because you're worried Russia could attack you as well?
Not necessarily, but two things took place. First, Russia tried to deny any enlargement of NATO, and that changed, in a way, very much our position here. So far we had thought that, okay, we are non-aligned of our own will. But when they said that, that meant that we do not have any will there left. So that was the first stage, and surely 24th of February, when they made a huge attack to Ukraine, that changed quite a lot. Well, it showed that they are ready to attack to an independent neighboring country.
So you were worried that you could be attacked?
Not necessarily, but I would say that things were changing also. Undoubtedly, and what we see now, Europe, the world, is more divided. There's not very much room for non-aligned in between. So that was also what we were thinking. I do not believe that they planned any attack on Finland, not then nor now.
A few years ago, Vladimir Putin said when he looks at your country, he sees friends, but warned that if you join NATO, he will see an enemy instead. I know you spoke with the Russian president yesterday. Does he now consider Finland an enemy? And how concerned are you that he may retaliate against you before your process continues and before you can fully qualify to be a member of NATO?
Actually, why I called him, I wanted just to confirm that now the situation is changed. We are going to apply membership. And in the same way, he confirmed that he thinks it's a mistake. We are not threatening you. Altogether, the discussion was very, would I say, calm and cool. And he didn't repeat those threats he had earlier and his people had been telling. That is that if Finland joins, that means some kind of contra steps, military contra steps, whatever that meant. But he didn't repeat it now, so I was not necessarily surprised, but it was, like I said, quite calm and cool.
Did he say anything that did surprise you?
Actually, the surprise was that he took it so calmly.
Do you really believe that?
But
that his tone actually will match
well,
how he feels?
I was about to come to that. That was something I was about to come. In security policy, especially talking with Russia, you have to keep in mind that what is said doesn't mean that you shouldn't be all the time quite well aware and follow up what really is happening. But so far, it seems that there's no immediate problems coming.
You need the unanimous approval of all 30 NATO members in order to join the alliance. But on Friday, The Turkish President Erdogan said he does not look, quote, positively toward Finland and Sweden joining. I know you said you're confused by his reaction, but do you think Turkey actually could block you from joining NATO?
First, why I was astonished was because I had a telephone discussion with President Erdogan that it's about 1 month ago, and then he said that they will estimate, well, positively our aim to apply membership, and now it changed. I believe that there will be a lot of discussion still, and I'm not that worried about that.
You're not. You think that ultimately Turkey will join the other NATO countries in approving your application?
It's very obvious that they demand some kind of discussion with Sweden and partly with Finland too. Maybe they will enlarge that discussion to other countries. We don't know. That's dealing with their PKK movement.
You spoke with President Zelensky of Ukraine just a few days ago, and as you know, he's extremely frustrated that NATO has not allowed Ukraine to join the alliance. Once Finland is part of NATO, will you advocate for Ukraine to be offered membership as well?
Actually, it's not in our hands, but I just want to tell that that President Zelensky was very positive with our membership. Maybe he sees that it's good that NATO shows that it is possible to enlarge, and maybe waiting for the future for them to try to do the same. But at the moment, we hear that it is not a solution.
President Sauli Niinistö, thank you so much. It's nice to see you again. As you said, a lot has changed in the 3 months since we spoke last, and I hope to speak to you again soon.
Let's hope that if a lot is changing again, it would change in a better. Thank you.
2 Republicans are surging ahead in Pennsylvania's primaries, but members of their own party are worried they can't win in the fall. Our political panel is next.
about Kathy Barnett. We can't trust Kathy Barnett for Senate.
I've been finding out things that are very alarming to me, and it will be fodder for the Democrats. This is our seat to lose, folks. We don't want to throw this away with a candidate who's not well vetted.
Kathy's going to be a lot of trouble. I think she's going to be a lot of trouble. She's totally an unknown, and we can't have that.
Down to the wire for the Pennsylvania Republican primaries, and that happens, actually Democratic primaries too, but let's talk about the Republican primary with our panel. And we have David Urban here, who is a Mr. Pennsylvania. I should say that you are supporting David McCormick.
The winner in the race.
In the primary for the Senate. But how worried are you about Kathy Barnett?
I think, Dana, I think everybody's kind of concerned a bit, right? As you said, as the tease let in, that Kathy Barnett's just unvetted. She's unknown. There are more questions about Kathy Barnett's resume than there are answers. And as you know, that is fodder for the Democrats in the fall. She's already run for Congress once and got drubbed.
Yeah.
And the concern is that she'll run again and get drubbed in the fall this year. And we can't do that. It's too important.
Let's pull back a little bit to widen the aperture, as they say, and look at what this means, Mia, for the Republican Party, because this is just going to be the latest in a real tug of war over whether or not people who Donald Trump supports, and that's almost exclusively people who believe in the big lie and so forth, versus others. Maybe those who consider themselves more traditional conservatives.
Well, okay, so first of all, I need to say that there's something that's poking at me. Those same words were said about me, by the way. I wasn't vetted enough. I didn't have enough experience, even though I was a mayor and on the city council. So unless you have something that is concrete, that you don't like, I really believe that you just need to give people a chance to get out there and talk about issues. So let's go back to talking about issues. That is what's going to make a difference.
Yeah, but Mia, this is a case. This is a case where there's holes in her resume. There's big holes about her military record, about her service. She said she worked on Wall Street. She worked in a bank in St. Louis. There are big holes about what she did in the military. She's not answering the press. The press is asking her about tweets. She's refusing to answer them.
But this is
that's unvetted.
For.
That's
this
unvetted. That's not you arguing about qualifications.
Well,
that's just not answering questions.
And this speaks to the larger picture of what Pennsylvania looks like. Paul Begala, you're no stranger to Pennsylvania politics. You've run a racer 10 there. Yeah. And the question is, it's a purple state, but if you have a Republican candidate for Senate who maybe you would consider unelectable, for governor, perhaps unelectable, do Democrats have what it takes to win those seats?
Well, they do. First off, Joe Biden won Pennsylvania by 80,568 votes. I say that because it's not because it's news, but because it's fact. And the leading Republican candidate for governor, Mr. Mastriano, denies that fact. He is a liar. He believes in the big lie. That seems to be a litmus test for Republicans. And the Senate side, I mean, I just let you two fight it out, but it's this guy McCormick, who's from Connecticut, this guy Oz, who's from New Jersey, and this woman Barnett, who's like from MAGA land. I'm not sure if any of them really reflect Pennsylvania, but it's you guys' party, so you can sort that out.
Let me bring in the state representative from Michigan, who you're talking about Michigan and other stuff. Excuse me, State Senator Mallory McMorrow. Thank you so much, first of all, for coming here and being on the panel. What are your views on this general idea of election deniers versus more traditional conservatives, and what it might mean for the Democrats on the ballot?
It is catastrophic, and I want us to take a step back and stop talking about putting up numbers and scores and what it means for Democrats and Republicans, because the question is, what does it mean for our country? What's happening in Pennsylvania is what's happening in Michigan right now, where it is a competition to see who can say the craziest, most offensive things. People who are more than willing to throw out the election. The Michigan Republican Party has been replacing board of canvassers with people who will willingly overturn the election. And it is not hyperbole to say this may be the very last free and fair election we ever have if traditional Republicans don't stand up and say it's enough and Democrats don't grow a spine.
I think this is going to be about what is happening in the economy. The person that can talk about the issues that we are facing, and they're very, very big issues. Inflation, gas prices, labor shortages. That's what Americans are worried about. And the person that can not talk about yesterday, not talk about even what's today, but what's next. And they have a vision for what's going next. We need some leadership, and Americans are tired.
And that's great
of
for general
relitigating.
election. I don't dispute that. That's exactly general election. But primary elections are very different. Paul knows it in Pennsylvania. The Pennsylvania Democratic primary is very messy. The Republican primary is very messy. Those things aren't what's resonating.
But then, David, where's the line? Where does the Republican Party stand up and say this has gone too far and we have to put an end to it?
I have a specific example. If you look at J.D. Vance in Ohio, he got the nomination of, he got the endorsement of Donald Trump. And that, what it did was really just push him over the edge of 5 candidates. But if you think about it, 340,991 to be exact, votes out of 1 million.
68% of people didn't vote for him.
68% did not vote for him.
I want to talk about issues in 1 second, but before we leave Pennsylvania, if Mehmet Oz or Kathy McCormick win,
Kathy
Barnett win the primary in Pennsylvania, will you vote for either of them?
Well, I don't.
Would you? I know you don't vote for them. Would you have?
No. Listen, I would support.
You support them?
I would support the Republican nominee in the Senate primary.
No matter what.
Sure, no matter what.
Okay.
I think, however, that David McCormick is the best general election candidate there by far. And in the governor's race, if Mastriano wins, I think he will lose.
But we support him. I'm sorry to press it, but he's telling a lie. Mallory's right. This is existential. This is not a fight about taxes. This is a guy who's lying to the people of Pennsylvania about who, Mr. Mastriano, about who won Pennsylvania.
Well, I don't disagree with you.
Okay,
No, but
so
that's disqualifying as a voter.
I asked about, to be fair, I asked about the Senate. Let's ask about the governor's race.
Yeah, the governor's race. Listen, I don't think I could support Doug Mastriano. I think he will lose badly, and I think that's the fear amongst, you saw it in the page of the Wall Street Journal editorial page. You say it amongst lots and lots of Republicans in this town and across America that we are going to snatch defeat from the jaws of victory in Pennsylvania with Doug Mastriano and either Mehmet Oz or Kathy Barnett. I think that's a giant concern.
Let's talk about issues. There is a new Monmouth University poll out this week that shows abortion nearly tied with the economy as voters' top concern going into the midterm elections.
It is not surprising. So to paint a picture of what this looks like, when Roe falls in Michigan, there's a 1931 law on the books right now that will go into effect immediately that makes abortion a felony. It is going to send women, girls, providers, families to jail for seeking abortion care, with no exception for rape or incest. This is a devastating moment that I think a lot of people knew was coming, and this is an economic issue. The ability to decide when it is right for a woman to become a mom is an economic issue.
This is something that just honestly sears my soul. I feel as if in this country we're forced to take sides between the mother and an unborn child when those are, it's unacceptable. I believe that we should be an advocate for life for both a mother with an unwanted pregnancy and an unborn child. Somebody has to advocate for that unborn child. So I think what Washington should be doing is doing more to give women more access to their reproductive health before they have to make a decision between ending a life and keeping a life. We're trying to deal with this issue on the back end instead of doing everything we can to prevent unwanted pregnancies. Why not empower women and also do everything we can to save the life of a child?
Respond?
Yeah, and I appreciate that answer, but it's operating in a reality that doesn't exist. This is a country that has no guaranteed paid leave, where childcare is unavoidable, where the idea of having a child or not, Michigan has the second steepest drop in birth rate in the entire country, behind only Illinois. And when I talk to my constituents, they can't afford it. So yes, we have to work to support families, but the Republican Party right now has done nothing to support that. We haven't supported Build Back Better to put those pieces in place to say we're supporting families. Instead, it is forcing women to be reproductive vessels.
And it shouldn't be that way. There is no reason why we can't get contraceptives over the counter, which is a bill that I pushed and supported, which it was both Democrats and Republicans that had a hard time getting on that. So we are not, again, it's unacceptable. We may be living in this reality, but I don't accept this reality. We have to change it because it's unacceptable to just say that, to ignore that there's actually an unborn child that needs an advocate.
This is the quietest I've ever heard these men at a table ever.
Listen, this is a great debate.
Yeah,
obviously, Mia and Mallory have very important voices, and I don't think I can add much.
Yeah, I will add, Mallory's home state of Michigan, my home state of Texas has a law just like that, Mallory. Life in prison, no exception for the doc, no exception for rape, no exception for incest. That's the reality that Texas women are going to wake up to in a few weeks. And I do think that's unacceptable.
Well, and this is an issue that is fundamentally about women and their doctors making a choice.
Got to end it there. Thank you so much for that very lively discussion. Thank you for spending your Sunday morning with us. Fareed Zakaria is next.
This is GPS, the Global Public Square. Welcome to all of you in the United States and around the world. I'm Fareed Zakaria, coming to you live from London. Today on the program, Vladimir Putin invaded Ukraine in part to weaken NATO. Now the leaders of Finland say they want their nation to join the Western Alliance. And Vladimir Putin is not pleased. I'll talk to the former British Prime Minister Tony Blair about this big move and much else. Then I'll talk to Ian Bremmer and Zanny Minton-Beddoes about the world's other crises, COVID, the economy, food, and more. Finally, I'll take you inside the mind of Vladimir Putin. It's a preview of my latest special, premiering tonight at 8 p.m. Eastern and Pacific. But first, here's my take. The Biden administration deserves huge credit for the economic measures it's been able to take against Russia for its invasion of Ukraine. As an essay by Gary Huffbauer and Megan Hogan note, they are the most comprehensive imposed against a major power since the Second World War. On a punishment scale, they rank them as at least an 8 out of 10. But the unprecedented nature of these measures is producing concerns around the world that the United States has weaponized its financial power and could lead over time to the decline of the dollar's dominance, which is what gives America its financial superpowers in the first place. Let me tell you about 3 reports from 3 good sources that I trust. One comes to me from New Delhi, reporting on a conversation that took place at the highest levels of India's government. The topic, how to make sure that the US could never do to India what it has just done to Russia. The second from Brussels, where staff at the European Commission have been tasked, even while working with Washington on the sanctions, to find ways to reduce the role of the dollar in its energy imports. The third, a shrewd Asian observer of China, speculated that the overly severe lockdowns in Shanghai, which even involved the rationing of food and basic supplies, might be part of an effort by Beijing to experiment with a scenario in which it faced economic sanctions from Washington, perhaps after an invasion of Taiwan. There is a raging debate going on right now about whether the dollar's total dominance of the international financial system is waning. Even Goldman Sachs and the IMF have warned that it might well happen. I tend to disagree. In my view, you can only beat the dollar with something better, and for the foreseeable future, there is no effective alternative. But it's clear that many countries, from China to Russia to even friendly nations like India and Brazil, are working hard on ways to reduce their vulnerability to Washington's whims. None of these efforts have so far gained much traction, though it's worth noting that the share of global foreign reserves held in dollars has declined from 71% to 59% over the last 2 decades. Now, partly this is because the United States appears less stable and predictable in the use of its extraordinary privilege. In the 2 decades preceding Russia's recent invasion, Washington massively ramped up sanctions for all kinds of reasons by more than 900%. Many of these measures have been overreactions and should be rolled back. After 9/11, Washington put in place highly intrusive measures aimed at tracking money going to terrorists. It has imposed harsh punishments on banks that do not adhere to all U.S. sanctions. It has sanctioned Iran, Venezuela, North Korea, Cuba, and others, often simply to satisfy domestic critics who wanted to do something but not pay much of a price. This kind of economic warfare has failed to change the regimes in any of these countries, but has caused widespread misery for ordinary people. Note that sanctions against Russia are aimed at policy change, not regime change, and therefore could be much more effective. Sanctions jumped up sharply during the Trump administration, which unilaterally withdrew from the Iran nuclear deal and then threatened to impose sanctions on anyone who traded with Tehran, even though the Iranians had adhered to the deal, which took place under a UN framework. And then there are the measures pursued domestically by American regulators and judges, like the almost $9 billion penalty against the French bank BNP Paribas in 2014. Again, all these only work because of the power of the dollar. I support the sanctions against Russia, but President Biden needs to make a speech explaining them. He needs to make clear that the Russian invasion of Ukraine marks the most serious assault on the rules-based international system in decades. If it succeeds, it could tear apart that system. That is why Washington has worked with its allies to impose these extraordinary measures. He needs to detail the legal basis for America and its allies' actions. For example, how exactly can governments seize privately owned property for which the owner, even if he is a Russian oligarch, has clear legal title? How can people be sure that these powers will not be abused? Biden needs to emphasize that the U.S. will only take such measures in the future when there are blatant violations of international law on the scale of Russia's actions. The dollar maintains its crucial role in the international system because the U.S. is the world's largest economy. It has the most liquid debt markets. Its currency floats freely, and crucially, it is regarded as a country based on the rule of law and not one prone to arbitrary and unilateral actions. That last criterion is not one that Washington has lived up to in recent years. President Biden should make sure that in fighting this battle against Russia, he does not erode America's unique financial superpower. Go to cnn.com/Fareed for a link to my Washington Post column this week. And let's get started. This morning, Finland's Prime Minister and President jointly announced that their nation would apply for NATO membership. Finland shares an 830-mile border with Russia. Unsurprisingly, Vladimir Putin has expressed his displeasure with the idea, calling it a mistake. I wanted to talk to the former British Prime Minister Tony Blair about this and much more. Blair is today the executive chairman of the Tony Blair Institute for Global Change. Welcome.
Thank you.
So, tell us what you think about this move. Finland and probably Sweden becoming members of NATO. This is a huge change. Finland has been neutral for, decades and decades. Do you think NATO should let them in?
Yes, and I think it's a completely sensible move from their perspective. You've had an act of unprovoked and brutal aggression against Ukraine, and obviously all of these countries are looking for the solidarity that NATO membership gives you. And it's an interesting example of how the very thing that President Putin wanted to prevent, which is NATO becoming stronger and enlarging, is going to be the very outcome of what he's done.
But what do you say to people who worry that this is the kind of westward expansion of NATO that has put a lot of Russians, not just Putin, at ill at ease, that, part of into the kind of combustible stew that produced this problem is NATO expansion and then offering Ukraine and Georgia membership. And this is one more kind of provocation that we should be mindful of Russia's security concerns.
I mean, a little bit of history here, because when I was Prime Minister, for the first part of my time, we were on good terms with Russia. Russia would attend NATO summits. There was every attempt to involve Russia in discussions to make sure that any fears were allayed. Russia was it was the G8 in my time, not the G7. And so this paranoid anxiety about the expansion of NATO being aimed at Russia always has been wrong and misplaced. However, now, with what has been this, as I say, this unprovoked aggression against Ukraine, of course, it's unsurprising that countries like Finland and Sweden now want the protection NATO gives. And I was a strong advocate of countries like Poland, Czech Republic coming in both to the European Union and to NATO after the fall of the Berlin Wall. And if you're the leadership of those countries today, you must be pleased you did that. So I think, at some point, we'll have to work out what the right security structure is and how we deal with Russia on a long-term basis. At some point, we'll have to do that. What's the right architecture? What are the right guardrails to have in place? Because with the old Soviet Union, there were graduated responses. Even though there was hostility, it was a Cold War precisely because there were certain rules. And I think at some point we'll have to go back and explore all of that. But for the moment, if you're Sweden or Finland, you're thinking, I need to be part of NATO, because that is the protection should the type of thing that's happened in Ukraine be visited upon us or we be threatened by it.
Does it strengthen NATO to have these two countries as part of it?
Yes, I think it does. And it also, NATO has rediscovered its sense of purpose. I mean, it's back on its feet again. I think there will be major increases in defense spending in NATO. You see what the Germans have already pledged to do. And to be fair, I think President Biden has done a really impressive job of pulling everyone together in a pretty coordinated way.
People have often said that Europe lacks a kind of strategic orientation, a strategic focus, that it doesn't coordinate on many issues. Do you think this could be the kind of event that triggers something even larger, a kind of coming together of Europe and thinking about its eastern border as its core strategic objective?
Well, I think it's a really good point. And I think that, yes, I think it will mean that Europe thinks much more strategically about its future and tries to get a set of common positions across a whole range of issues. But I also think it will encourage America and Europe together. That transatlantic alliance, I think, also can undergo a revival. And what is important is that we learn from this and that we pivot to what I would call a more strategic view of the world, that not just around Russia, but around our attitude to China, to the Middle East, to Africa, where I spend a lot of my time with my institute, and you can see how China's obviously expanded its power and influence there. Russia also moving in recently. We need a whole recalibration of Western policy, and the way that we have assembled this unity on this issue of Ukraine is a good lesson for the rest of the world.
All right, stay with us. When we come back, we're going to talk about when Tony Blair met Vladimir Putin for the first time. I'll ask him what he thinks the world needs to know about Vladimir Putin and much more when we come back. Vladimir Putin's first visit to the West after he was elected president of Russia landed him in London in April 2000. There he was welcomed to 10 Downing Street by the then Prime Minister Tony Blair. Blair met with Putin many, many more times. We are back here in London with Tony Blair.
The aging process is a little bit visible from those old pictures, but anyway.
Not of Putin, by the way, more of you.
Exactly.
What did you tell us? Everyone is wondering about this question. He seemed rational, incremental, calculating, logical. He now seems emotional, angry. What is your sense of the trajectory?
So the first Putin I met was Western-facing, anxious to have a good relationship with the West. He used to insist that we met in St. Petersburg because it's the Western-facing great city of Russia. Then I think he found the challenges of reform and change in Russia too great, and he decided to consolidate power in a more autocratic way and then become a Russian nationalist. And so the second incarnation of Putin, if you like, was cold and calculating and brutal, but still, I would say, entirely rational within his own terms. The anxiety I think everyone has is that he's now completely detached from reality, surrounded by people who won't tell him the truth. And this is why this, incredible miscalculation. Right. Leave aside the wickedness of it. The miscalculation strategically and in every possible way has been enormous. How he could ever have thought, anyone who knows Ukraine, and we both know Ukraine, anyone who knows it, knows that there was never any question of Ukrainians agreeing to be subjugated to Russia in this way. So I think that's the worry. The trajectory has been away from a reforming, Western-oriented leader who could have allowed Russia to become part of the West. People even used to talk in the old days. I'm talking those times when I was there. Then people were even talking about, could Russia become a member of the European Union? That's right. Was there a way Russia could be accommodated literally within the structures of NATO? And it's very important people remember this, because this myth that Putin perpetrates, that we were somehow always trying to push him and humiliate Russia. Russia's problem is not the result of our humiliation of Russia. It's as a result of bad government in Russia.
Joe Biden says that his worry is that Putin is cornered and he doesn't have a way out. So what should the West and Ukraine do? Should there be an active search for an off-ramp? Or are you of the view, let's first make sure that Ukraine kind of prevails in this and not worry so much about giving Putin a face-saving way out?
Okay, so I think we've got to be guided by the Ukrainians and their leadership, because their leadership has been incredibly impressive. I don't just mean President Zelensky, but the others as well. But it's been impressive not merely by the courage, but they've showed a real intelligence about how they've approached it. And I think in the first weeks of this conflict, before it became extraordinarily brutal, I think they would have taken a way out and offered that off-ramp. But I think their attitude now, because of the way that Putin is trying to take that whole southern corridor and block Odessa, really, from Ukraine, I think now the Ukrainians will believe they've done well militarily, much better than anyone expected. They're going to get more support from the West. I think they will have to choose the moment, if there is one, at which they look at the possibility of a negotiated settlement. But it's a lot harder to do now, because there is no way any Ukrainian leader is going to agree that Putin should get anything out of this invasion at all. Now, I do think there are larger issues, we were talking about them before, around what is the type of security infrastructure, architecture rather, we need for the future relationship with Russia. But I don't favor pushing the Ukrainians into a premature negotiation, just as I wouldn't hold them back if they consider there is an optimum moment, maybe after the summer months.
And then you get to the game of what does the West ask for in return for the relaxation of sanctions, which is presumably one of the key Russian demands is going to be. And it just strikes me that this is going to go on for a long time. That again, one of Putin's miscalculations is, I don't think this somehow magically all disappears. These sanctions have been put in place, the energy depend. The West is going to take its time rolling this back. So would you agree we're looking at a new world and that this is not going to get resolved in years?
Yeah, I mean, 100%. And the thing is, you've got the sanctions, the actual legally enforceable sanctions, but then you've got a couple of other things. You've got, first of all, the fact that there's no one going to do business with Putin. And I think, is it 1,000 companies have withdrawn from Russia? I don't think they're going to go back in whilst Putin remains in power. So that isolation, which is as much voluntary as it is mandated, will remain. And the second thing is that Europe, I mean, it's learnt its lesson now. It will change its energy policy fundamentally to release itself from dependence on Russian oil and gas. Now, it may take some time in the case of gas and so on and so forth, but that's going to happen. It's absolutely inevitable because no one will want to be in a position, again, where there's any question of having a conflict between what you need to do and your dependence on Russian energy.
All right, before I let you go, I have to ask you, you were so instrumental in bringing stability to Ireland, to Northern Ireland. What does it mean that you now have a party in power there that in some ways is part of the old hope of a united Ireland? Is there now a possibility that Ireland and Northern Ireland will be united?
Well, it's back on the agenda, let's say, in a way that it wasn't before. But the key immediate thing, because that's a whole longer term play, the key immediate thing is to get this dispute between the UK and the European Union resolved. It's very, very damaging. It really arises out of the fact that the UK entered into an agreement back in October 2019 that it doesn't really want to keep to. And unsurprisingly, the Europeans are saying you do have to keep to it. I think there is a way through. There is a way through the technical and practical problems of how you organize trade between Britain, the island of Britain, and Northern Ireland. But it's going to require the Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, will have to work out what he thinks is a sensible final negotiating position. And then he's going to have to go and sell it and persuade the European leaders. This isn't going to get solved by the systems, not by the Commission system, not by the UK system. The only way you resolve something like this, and my experience of dealing with Europe, is to elevate it to the leaders' level and get it settled there.
One more example of the damage to Britain that Brexit has caused.
Well, it was inevitable we would have this problem because the moment you take the whole of the UK out of the single market and customs union of Europe, where we've been for 4 decades, then the hard external border of the European Union is between the north of Ireland and the south of Ireland. So it was always going to be a problem. And, we just, look, it's happened, Brexit. Obviously, I disagree with it. We've got to make the best of it. But we need to resolve this because otherwise we will put the union of the United Kingdom at risk.
Tony Blair, always a pleasure.
Thank you.
Next on GPS, Putin's war in Ukraine is, of course, not the only crisis facing the world. I will talk about COVID, the economy, much more with a terrific panel when we come back. The war in Ukraine might be garnering the majority of the headlines, but there is still a pandemic raging. The U.S. just marked 1 million COVID dead this week, and 1/3 of the world remains unvaccinated. And those two crises, the pandemic and the war, are lighting a fire under a growing global economic crisis. So what is to be done? Joining me now here in London is Zanny Minton-Beddoes, the editor-in-chief of The Economist, and Ian Bremmer is with us from New York. He's the president of the Eurasia Group and the author of a terrific new book, The Power of Crisis, How Three Threats and Our Response Will Change the World. Ian, let me start with you, and let me ask you a question about crises, since you are now a world expert on crises. Why is it that the Russia-Ukraine crisis or 9/11, these sort of geopolitical crises trigger huge global responses, but this enormous crisis of the pandemic, 1 million dead in the United States, 5 million dead around the world, it hasn't really gotten us to change much of anything. What do you think explains that?
Probably 15 million, according to the CDC, but your point is all the stronger. Look, in the case of the Russia crisis, the information space is in the West completely all together. They're with Zelensky, they're with Ukraine, and that certainly makes a difference in terms of being able to compel Western response. And secondly, over time, the level of concern about the crisis only grew. I mean, if the Russians had actually taken Kiev in the first few days and had ousted Zelensky, it would have been much less of a problem, frankly, and you wouldn't have seen Finland and Sweden joining NATO, and you wouldn't have seen the same level of support for the Ukrainians or the sanctions. In the case of the pandemic, in the early days, Fauci was lionized, the CDC, great concern, but in relatively short order, you politicized the crisis and you also lost the same level of concern. Once you had therapeutics, once you had a vaccine, suddenly it became less of a concern for everyone together, and you actually lost that momentum. What you need, Fareed, is what I call in the book a Goldilocks crisis. You don't want it to be so big that you curl into a ball in the corner and wait for the world to end, but it can't be so small that you can be politically divided and not inconvenience yourself. Russia-Ukraine is a Goldilocks crisis, and frankly, the pandemic is not.
Zanny, let me ask you, first, you agree that with the Goldilocks crisis idea, but more importantly, it may be a Goldilocks crisis in the sense that it's not so big that it overwhelms, and there is a response to it, but it does feel like it has follow-on crises, energy crisis, economic crisis. Europe is almost certainly going to go into recession, food crisis. How bad are these follow-on crises that are going to come out of the Russia-Ukraine crisis?
So I think they're pretty big. I mean, I like Ian's idea of a Goldilocks crisis. You kind of want a Goldilocks everything. You want a Goldilocks economy, you want a Goldilocks, global financial system. You want everything not to be too hot and not to be too cold. But I actually think Ukraine is a huge reshaping of the global geopolitical order, and we can talk about that, and that will have very, very big consequences. We're obviously seeing them in the likely expansion of NATO now, but there are very big immediate crises coming on top of that. And the one that really worries me right now is the global food crisis. And this, I think, is something that is just coming onto the agenda. It is going to be dominating, I predict, the conversation in the next few months. And let me just tell you why. Long before Vladimir Putin invaded Ukraine, 2022 was already set to be one of the most dangerous and worst food crises in the post-war period. We've had a lot of droughts around the world. Latin America has had 2 years running of very poor harvests. North Africa, very poor harvest. The US harvest doesn't look so great, the early predictions.
And this is all mostly climate.
This was climate related, absolutely. And so global grain stocks were already very low before Vladimir Putin invaded. Now, Ukraine and Russia between them, it's hard to exaggerate how important these countries are. They are 30% of globally traded wheat. They are equally big proportions of barley, corn, all manner of other things. 80% of sunflower oil, which is a big, edible oil. If you put all of it together, I think it's something like 12% of global calories traded come from these two countries. And what you've seen in the last few weeks is essentially a dramatic reduction, both because Ukraine has been blockaded, as you know, the ports of Odessa by the Russians. They've been mined. They can't get any exports out. That means all of the harvest from last year that hadn't already been exported can't get out. There have been, many farms have been hit by Russian shelling, Russian ordnance, so the likely production is going to be lower. Russia's not going to be able to export as much. And then just to add to this, both countries, but particularly Russia, are huge sources of energy and inputs for fertilizer, which means that next year's harvest around the world, Brazil gets a ton of its fertilizer inputs from Russia. All of this stuff is going to be hit. And people who are in this world are increasingly alarmed that we are going to be facing the biggest food crisis since the First World War, not just in recent decades. It's a huge, huge deal. And so I think that is not, to use Ian's terminology, a Goldilocks crisis.
So Ian, this raises an interesting problem. We have found a kind of military political response to the Russian-Ukraine crisis. But do we have anything near the kind of global coordination, the kind of sense of a humanitarian crisis to deal with the crisis Zanny's talking about?
Well, we don't even have a global response to the Russia crisis because it's about advanced industrial democracies. Poorer countries, middle-income countries around the world are not with the United States, not democracies versus autocracies. But the West is together, and that matters. Will the West be together on the global food crisis? I agree completely with Zanny about the order of magnitude of concern here. But I also fear that the Western response to global food crisis is going to be akin to where we were on climate 10, 15, 20 years ago, which is a big deal. We really should worry about it, but it's mostly about poorer people in poorer countries. In the United States and Europe, we'll have enough to do things for ourselves. And how much do we care about Sri Lanka or Tunisia or Egypt or Lebanon or some of the countries that are really going to be under the gun here, have been for the last 2 years with the pandemic, and now even worse? I'm concerned that the West does not feel that this is an urgent crisis for them, and as a consequence, this is likely to get much worse before it gets better for the average person. And there'll be hundreds of millions of people that are going to be seriously food stressed over the coming 2 years minimum because of the level of disruption from Russia and Ukraine and the supply chain knock-on that we see from both the direct foodstuffs, from fertilizers, and from global energy.
All right, we are going to have to take a break. When we come back, we'll get back to this, but also China, COVID, economic growth, all that when we come back. And we are back here on GPS with Ian Bremmer in New York and Zanny Minton-Beddoes here in London. Zanny, you talked about this food crisis, which sounds, you said, the worst food crisis since the First World War. So basically in almost 100 years. What to do about it?
Well, I think the most important thing is to get the world together to try and alleviate the things that can be alleviated. The quick things are, can you get the port of Odessa opened? That will get the stuff that is currently, the grains that are currently in Ukraine out. Right now, that's impossible. The Ukrainians have mined it because they're worried about, well, the Russians are trying to shell it. But that is a consequence of the Russian action. And I think there is a chance.
That's not sanctions, in other words.
It's not sanctions. And I think there's a chance as a result to change the narrative, because much of the narrative in the global south, if you will, is a narrative that they are being hit by a war that has nothing to do with them and the sanctions that the West has imposed. Russia has been very good at politicizing this narrative in the global south. But in fact, a lot of this has not to do with the sanctions. It has to do with Russian actions. And I think if the West, if the United States is clever about it, it can bring countries on board, whether it's the South Africas, whether it's the Brazils. Even India can be brought in to try and put pressure or to come up with a plan to get these supplies out, because they are the biggest losers, North African countries, Turkey. But unfortunately, right now, we see that actually we're going in the opposite direction. India, as you know, just yesterday imposed an export ban on wheat, and many people had been relying. India has a lot of stocks right now. They'd been relying on India to supply the global wheat market. So right now, it looks as though we're going in the opposite direction, that of beggar thy neighbor, protectionism, each country banning exports, which would really mean we end up in a global disaster. But if you can bring countries on board to find a way, and it will be hard, to find a way to get the grain that is in these countries, particularly in Ukraine, out, then I think there is some way, perhaps not just of alleviating the crisis, but of giving a sense that the global south has a stake in this, which is really, really important.
Ian, I got to ask you.
I want to jump in on that.
Yeah, do it quickly, because I got to ask you about China and Chinese economic growth, which seems veering, very, very low because of the insistence on zero COVID.
Absolutely true. The quick point I wanted to make is so much of the narrative we've heard from the developing world is, you care about Ukraine because they're European, because they're white, 6 million refugees. You didn't care about the Syrians. You don't care about Yemen or Afghanistan. The reality is this is a vastly more important conflict for the developing world because of the interdependence of the global economy. They should care more about Russia, Ukraine. They should be more invested precisely because this is going to hurt them in a way that Yemen and Syria and Afghanistan really didn't. And the world isn't there today. We have to spread that narrative. But China, this is a huge problem. This is the second largest economy in the world, and they were the most effective in responding to COVID once they admitted that COVID existed for the first year. They're the only ones that had growth, but they've stuck with it. And they've stuck with the same exact zero COVID policy when they don't have the vaccines, when they don't have the therapeutics. And now that's really causing more supply chain challenges on top of everything we've just been discussing. And by the way, this is fixable. The fact is that the single greatest excess commodity we have in the world right now, it's not energy, it's not food, it's not fertilizer, it's mRNA vaccines for COVID. We can't get them in the arms of Africans because we don't have the infrastructure on the ground. The Chinese do, but they refuse to accept international coordination and help because they're so angry at the way they were blamed, and they're so angry about the way that COVID has gone through the rest of the world while the Chinese locked it down. As a consequence, we are all suffering. We can't coordinate on COVID.
Thoughts on China's, if it's aiming for zero COVID, it appears to be getting zero economic growth. That's an exaggeration, but how bad is that?
I think it's pretty bad. And I think it is clearly, you cannot have zero COVID. This is a strategy that in the long run cannot work. But unfortunately, in a year where Xi Jinping wants to become, at the National Party Congress later this year, effectively ruler for life, I think we're getting to the stage where no one dares tell him. No one dares say this is not going to work. And if you mix that, or if you add to that to the clampdown on tech that he did in the last few months, I'm increasingly worried that China is moving to a sort of slightly erratic, autocratic, ultra-personal autocratic system of government. And so I'm deeply worried about China. But just to end on a really good note, and particularly to you, Fareed, I've just been in India, and I am much more upbeat in India. Our cover story this week in India is they could blow it. The Modi government could blow it. But India has the ingredients, both luck, because of China's travails and because the world wants an alternative supplier, because they've benefited from their huge investment in digital tech, because of a lot of things that are going right for them. I'm very, very upbeat on the potential for India. This year it's going to be the fastest growing economy in the world, and it could be for the next 10 years if they play things right.
120 degrees Fahrenheit in Delhi right now, Fareed. I don't know.
All right, we're going to have to leave it at that, and I'm going to tell people to read the current issue of The Economist and buy Ian Bremmer's new book, or read it if you can find a way to do that without buying it, but I think Ian would like you to buy it. Next on GPS, Inside Putin's Mind. I'm going to take you there. It's the title of my latest special, which premieres tonight at 8 p.m. Eastern and Pacific. When we come back, you'll get a sneak peek. Ever since Vladimir Putin ascended to the world stage in the late 1990s, I've been curious about him and what makes him tick. I've met him and had private conversations with him a handful of times. I've only interviewed him once for TV at a conference in St. Petersburg. But the crucial question of whether Putin has changed from a cold, calculating, incremental, rational actor to someone emotional, out of control, wild, maybe ill, is at the center of this crisis, because the only way we are going to get out of it is if there is some kind of negotiated settlement, something that Putin is willing to accept, some kind of deal where he is rationally able to see that he gets something and he gives something. So all that makes it important, more important than ever, that we try to understand the Russian leader's motivations, his mind. So I've spent the last few months working on a new special called Inside the Mind of Vladimir Putin. It premieres tonight at 8 p.m. Eastern and Pacific. In this clip, we take you back to 1990, when Putin was still working for the KGB and Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev was opening up that nation internally and to the world. Suddenly, Russia began to look like the United States.
Today we are opening the first McDonald's in Moscow.
It's very nice, I like it. Big Mac is Big Mac. Coca-Cola, Coca-Cola.
Almost overnight.
Я хочу сказать, что Микки Маус.
New freedoms, capitalism, Western values. It all looked great from the West. To Vladimir Putin, it was a catastrophe.
Vladimir Putin views the breakup of the Soviet Union, as he said himself, to be the greatest geopolitical tragedy of the 20th century.
But it wasn't just geography to Putin. The breakup, he said, tore millions of Russians away from the country they loved, the country in which they belonged.
Tens of millions of Russians, Russian speakers, were quote-unquote abandoned and ripped away from us. It didn't have to be. The Soviet Union was our common past.
The most painful separation for Putin?
Of all of the former parts of the Soviet Union, Ukraine mattered the most.
Ukraine, the loss Putin never got over. Part not just of the Soviet Union, but also the Tsar's empire.
And because it had belonged to Russia for 300 years.
Putin's brutal assault on Ukraine may be the fulfillment of his greatest dream. The world sees an unprovoked bloodbath. Putin sees a chance to restore the core of the Russian Empire.
I think that down deep in Putin, there is this sense of extraordinary humiliation over the collapse of the Soviet Union, because it wasn't just the Soviet Union, it was the Russian Empire.
He has seen the collapse of empire once. I think in his mind, he is rebuilding what was lost in 1991.
Please make sure to set your alarms for 8 p.m. Eastern or Pacific so that you can watch this new special, Inside the Mind of Vladimir Putin. Our international viewers can watch at 1 a.m. London or 4 a.m. Abu Dhabi or 8 a.m. Singapore or whatever 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time in the United States translates to for you. Thanks to all of you for being part of my program this week. I will see you next week. Oh, tonight and next week.
Want a daily dose of Fareed and his team? Now you can get it with Fareed's Global Briefing, the newsletter that gives you the best insight and analysis on global affairs. Go to cnn.com/Fareed to sign up.
Hey, I'm Brian Stelter, live in New York, and this is Reliable Sources, where we examine the story behind the story and we figure out what's reliable. This hour, a veteran correspondent fatally shot on assignment, and Israel accused of murder. An Israeli official will be here live with a response. Plus, while the national media focuses on the Supreme Court, what are we missing about abortion laws at the state level? A top reporter will join us live from Texas. Plus, my road trip to Pennsylvania this weekend, witnessing a GOP campaign's ban against the media up close. Is this the ugly new normal in Republican politics? We're going to get into that and a whole lot more coming up. But first, another hate crime at a grocery store. Those words shouldn't even compute. They shouldn't fit in the same sentence. A hate crime at a grocery store. This time it was Buffalo residents in a predominantly black neighborhood who were just trying to take care of their families when a white gunman opened fire on Saturday, killing 10 people and injuring 3 others. All the evidence so far suggests that this young man, this suspect, just 18 years old, was poisoned by lies and BS from online message boards. Now police, members of the media are going through his so-called manifesto, full of hateful memes and ideas, and some of the same messages shared by the Christchurch mosque killer. Yes, it's the great replacement theory rearing its ugly head again, this white replacement nonsense. It convinces isolated men on the internet that a cabal is replacing whites with people of color. It's the same conspiracy theory you hear in primetime on Fox News. So it's important, no, it's essential to map the media environment that preys on white fear. The manifesto's author attributed most of his beliefs to the internet and described himself as a fascist, a white supremacist, and an anti-Semite. The manifesto reportedly throws around terms like critical race theory, and the author writes about becoming radicalized partially because he was bored during the pandemic. Bored. Now again, there's a lot for investigators to get into. We are still in the early stages of this story, but there's a lot of evidence because of the purported manifesto and a live stream that was posted on Twitch, the popular gaming streaming service. Now, Twitch says the video was removed within minutes, but some of the video clips and images are still circulating online. There are now calls for accountability for social media firms, but the rot goes a lot deeper. You can't just blame one single social networking site and say that's the problem. The problem is a lot more complex. So let's talk about it with Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist Wesley Lowery. He's in Washington right now. And here in New York, Mara Schiavocampo, her co-host of the Run Tell This podcast, along with Lowery, and a former ABC and NBC correspondent. Also here with me, CNN senior media reporter Oliver Darcy. Thank you all for coming on the program this weekend. Mara, let's talk about white versus black. How are these sorts of shooters, these suspects, treated by the media when there's a heinous hate crime that occurs?
You know, it's really important to examine how the media talks about white shooters. And there are some predictable patterns. I mean, first, there's almost always this presumption of mental illness that absolves the shooter from any personal responsibility. They are often described as kids. You know, they're infantilized, they're humanized in a way that makes them seem sympathetic. You know, just a good kid who snapped. But most importantly, and I think this is most important because it's so inaccurate, they're almost always portrayed as a lone wolf, just acting by themselves. When this is inaccurate, because we know that these are violent domestic terrorists who subscribe to a group ideology of white supremacy. So in the case of these white shooters, they're portrayed as lone wolves who bear sole responsibility for what's happened. But if they were Muslims, say, it would be a responsibility that's borne by the entire religion. They would be immediately branded terrorists. We need to start talking about these incidents in the context of domestic terrorism fueled by white supremacist ideology.
Right, white supremacist terrorism. Wesley, that point about lone wolves is really important. I heard you, you were tweeting about this overnight. You just said you finished a book. You were working on a book about this topic of white supremacy terrorism, and now, once again, it's back in the news. What do you think people need to know about how this should be covered in the press?
Of course, I think so often we treat, especially around white supremacists, we think of them as our kooky old grandmother, right? It's our racist friend who makes a joke we shouldn't make. And what are we supposed to do? I mean, they say some bigoted things. I think that too often we treat white supremacist terror in society, in elite spaces, in the media, as these one-offs and not as an advanced, coherent ideology, right? That this ideology that claimed lives in the grocery store in Buffalo is the same ideology that claimed Jewish lives in Pittsburgh at the Tree of Life Synagogue, the same ideology that claimed lives down at the Walmart in El Paso, right? That there is a complex conspiracy theory that's as old as our American society, in which white Americans are being told and being poisoned through the internet, but also through some relatively mainstream media organizations on the right, being told that they're facing a demographic crisis and that they have to stand up for themselves. And
let's just be clear, Wes, you're talking about Tucker Carlson. You're talking about Laura Ingraham. You're talking about the biggest stars on Fox News. Is it too simplistic to reduce this to a single television show, though?
Yes. I mean,
I'm seeing a lot of that on social media. Just blaming Fox, just blaming Tucker. And I think there's a lot of blame to go around.
There's a ton. I mean, look, let's be clear. The stuff Tucker and Laura Ingraham say every night, it could be written by white supremacists very often. There's a section of this manifesto where the shooter starts talking about, people always say diversity is strength. How is it strength? I could hear it in Tucker's voice. He says this all the time, right? But the Ben Shapiros of the world say this. There's a big chunk about the idea of genetic differences that could have been pulled from an Andrew Sullivan column, right? There are plenty of people in our politics, in our media, who advance these ideas and advance them frequently. But beyond that, though, I do think the point you're making here is right. We cannot simplify this specifically just to a specific network, even to specific online spaces. We have to have a conversation about our political rhetoric in our country, right? Immigration for the last several decades has been the most salient topic in our politics. It's what Donald Trump rode into power, is something Republicans have seized upon. It's something that in our rhetoric and in our conversation, very often mainstream political forces have been remarkably irresponsible in the language they've used around immigration, around race, in ways that have fueled and empowered white supremacists. And again, it's not just people on the far right. I mean, we're talking on CNN where for years Lou Dobbs was given an hour every night to say some pretty racist things about immigrants at the heart of this conversation. And so I think it's something that we all have to take very seriously, because when we take it seriously, it forces us to actually consider the words we use, especially when we're advancing stereotypes about immigrants, about Jewish people, about black people, the way George Soros' name is thrown around, the way people talk about immigrants and crime, right? All of these things play into racist, white supremacist tropes.
Let's continue to map this media environment, because as we talk, the more we talk here, the more complex it gets, and that's important. This is complicated. Oliver, what are the other media arms or tentacles or elements to this? I mean, I'm thinking about message boards that most of us haven't heard of and probably hopefully never will, where some of these ideas fester. And yes, they do end up spreading upwards toward Tucker Carlson's show and many others, but these start deep into dark corners of the internet. Is that right to say? Is that fair to say?
Yeah, they start in deep, dark corners of the internet. And as we saw, even with Tucker Carlson, his former writer was one of these people on these deep, dark corners of the internet, one particular message board, and taking ideas from them and putting it into Tucker's prompter, where he would say it to millions of people every night. So there is a connection, too, between what happens on these dark places of the internet and what ends up, on Fox. But these things do fester on boards like 4chan, where they were to some degree
or even on Twitch. I'm so interested in this angle. Axios last week had a headliner last month. Gaming, extremism becoming more common in gaming spaces.
Yeah.
So you're on a live stream, you're playing a video game, your friends are talking, they're saying racist comments, and to me, I wonder, that's almost like an opening. That's an in for an 18-year-old, someone who's 15, 16, 17 years old. They start by just joking around with their friends, casually saying racist things, and then they go deep down these rabbit holes, these scary websites.
Even on Twitter, it's there. And you have GOP representatives. Matt Gaetz was defending the Great Replacement theory, which is at the heart of this screed that was written purportedly by the suspect. And so, this is something that, it was, I think, relegated to darker corners of the internet, and it still festers there, but it has been mainstream.
Right, we shouldn't call it fringe anymore. It's not fringe anymore. What's already happened.
Right.
There's already far-right figures making excuses, saying this was a false flag, this was a conspiracy op to make us look bad. It's already happening.
Yeah.
I feel so exhausted and defeated this morning, Mara, because we know exactly what's going to happen in the next few days. Nothing's going to change. It's only going to get worse. And what do we do?
Well, I
guess all we do is cover it.
There's no question that outlets like Fox News are responsible in large part for mainstreaming these conspiracy theories that have largely been relegated in the past to the far right fringe. So when we talk about this replacement theory, this is the idea that there is a plot, an active plot to replace white Americans with immigrants. Now, this is something that used to be on the fringes. Tucker Carlson first spoke about it on his show more than a year ago, and since then we have heard members of Congress repeat it.
And the New York Times found that he's repeated a version of it 400 times. times.
Many, many times. This has become a drumbeat that we hear a lot. We're hearing it in mainstream places. We're hearing it on the floor of Congress. And so there's no question that they have a big role in the mainstreaming of this. And you ask about the impact. Aren't there others? What's significant about Fox News is the size of their audience. Sure, there are lots of players in this game, but they have a massive audience, and they are repeating these points over and over and over again. That's how the big lie led to January 6th. We see that it has an effect.
You know what's going to happen, Wes? You know what's going to happen on Tucker Show tomorrow night? He's going to say he condemns all violence, he abhors all violence, and then he might say something like, what about the hundreds of illegal immigrants that crossed the border over the weekend? What about all the violence that they could cause? Brian Kilmeade was on Twitter calling it an invasion yesterday. We've seen this, right? That he's gonna divert, he's gonna deflect, he's gonna distract. How do you avoid getting exhausted by all this?
I certainly don't avoid getting exhausted by it.
You just finished the book,
exhausted by it. I think that you're right, and I'm sure part of the talking points will be actually this shooter was a leftist, and why are you blaming us? And it's not really the right, it's not really Republicans. And look, there's a point worth making that racism and bigotry exist across the political spectrum. But when we look at the media figures and the political figures who are driving white supremacist violence, who white supremacists identify with, who they consider allies in indoctrinating and proselytizing to the country, it's figures on the right. Time and time and time again, very often being cited in these manifestos, sometimes by name, other times in hyperlinks. And so it is exhausting. But I guess the one other point I would make, obviously we're talking about this in the media perspective because we all talk with the media, it's a media show, right? But one of the reasons this stuff is effective, right, is because these ideas are as old as the American society, right? It's a little simplistic to think, well, if only we could shut Tucker Carlson up, or if only we could shut down this message board. These ideas have a salience and have a staying power because fear of others, fear of people who are different than us, has always been among the most powerful political and societal forces. And at a time when Americans across the country, white Americans particularly, fear demographic change, these messages are extremely powerful. And so again, we could wake up tomorrow and Fox News could be shut down and all the message boards could be shut down, and these ideas would not disappear. And I think that's important for us to remember and to think about as well.
And for the record, because Tucker Carlson's probably watching and probably going to play these clips tomorrow, I don't think anyone's trying to shut him up. I think his critics should try to find powerful, persuasive ways to prove he's wrong. That's the most effective answer. Wesley, thank you. Mara, thank you. Oliver, please stick around. Lots more to get to later this hour. We're going to get into Elon Musk and Twitter and all the rest. But up first, urgent calls for answers after the death of a veteran Al Jazeera correspondent. We're going to get into it, show you what happened, coming up. The honest voice never dies. That's what people were chanting after Al Jazeera correspondent Shireen Abu Akleh was killed on assignment in the West Bank this week. But will she ever receive justice? The Palestinian-American journalist worked for Al Jazeera's Arabic television channel for 25 years, so she was considered an authority of Palestinian coverage. On Wednesday, while covering an Israeli military raid on the occupied West Bank city of Jenin, she was shot and killed at age 51. Her producer was also wounded and is said to be in stable condition. Another journalist on the scene said the press waited for soldiers to see them before moving toward a camp in Jenin, but, quote, out of nowhere, there were gunshots. Now, in this next disturbing video clip, you can hear some gunfire and then see the reporter's body slumped on the ground. These journalists were on assignment, doing their jobs, wearing press badges, which are supposed to be symbols of protection, but sometimes are not. Al Jazeera is blaming Israel for killing Abu Akleh, calling it an assassination. The news of her death was shocking to Palestinians who saw her as the voice of their struggles, almost like a family friend. One CNN producer who grew up watching her said, quote, she was an icon as a Palestinian journalist. She was very simple, humble, and very funny. Thousands of people gathered for her funeral in Jerusalem on Friday, but what began peaceful turned violent. You see the images there. In some cases, there were people being beaten by Israeli forces. There's a global condemnation of that violence and an outcry for answers and accountability, with lingering questions about who killed this journalist and why. Ambassador Asaf Zamir is with me. He's the Consul General of Israel in New York, and he's joining me here on set. We did ask Al Jazeera to appear here as well, but they declined to provide a guest. Thank you for coming on the program. Is there anything new you can tell us about the investigation into the shooting?
First of all, thank you for having me. We don't know anything new because there is no dual investigation yet, because the Palestinian Authority is neglecting to our request to have a joint investigation. Anyhow, I want to start out by saying how sorry we are. Any death of any reporter inside that area is a tragedy, and we need to do everything in our powers to make sure it doesn't happen again.
What can be done to make sure it doesn't happen again?
Well, first of all, we need to have an investigation now to understand how it happened to begin with, but we also need to remember the full context of it, because we're kind of starting the story in the middle.
Tell me why.
Because in the last month, 19 Israelis were brutally murdered in terror attacks, not as journalists covering a war zone in conflict, but just sitting in their cars, having beers, walking in the parks, just for being Jewish and living in Israel. And we had to go into Jenin to try and prevent the next terror attack coming out of it, and that is the raid in which, at the end, in the fire shots, Shireen Abu Akleh was killed, which is again a tragedy. We don't know who from. We were seeing central media, social media, politicians in the United States and all over the world claiming it's Israel before we had any proof of it. While the Palestinian corner said, we've examined the bullet, it's too close to call, we don't know yet, we still had media outlets and American elected officials saying and blaming Israel. And the fact that Al Jazeera is blaming Israel, I take that in a certain proportion. Al Jazeera, people need to be reminded sometimes, it's not free media like CNN is free media. It's state-owned media. It's the Qatari national media outlet. It's like Russia Today. Russia Today has been used in the last month to explain the Russian side of the war and to call Zelensky a Nazi. And it's the kind of media that we need to take into in the right perspective when we analyze what they say.
I also think Al Jazeera has some excellent journalists.
I think they have some excellent journalists. I think she was an excellent journalist. It's a tragedy, but everyone thinks it's a tragedy. I think that we need to do everything in our power to make sure that these things don't happen again, but we can't do that alone, which is why we've been calling from our side. And we've been doing it responsibly. We believe in taking responsibility. We said, we don't know who it is.
Right.
The Palestinians didn't say that. We said, we don't know how she died. The Palestinians haven't said that yet. We're looking for a joint investigation with another third party, anything to make sure we understand what the truth is, to make sure this doesn't happen again. But just as you invited someone to sit next to me and they declined, it's kind of the same case. We can't find a partner to do this investigation with, and we can't do it alone.
Last year, the IDF bombed a building in Gaza that housed the AP bureau in Gaza. There were concerns then that journalists were being targeted. Israel did warn people in the building so they could leave, so there were no deaths. But you have to wonder then if there's a pattern of Israel targeting members of the media. Is there a pattern?
Of course not. There is no pattern. In Israel, by the way, free press is extremely important. That is why we want to conduct this investigation to begin with. That free press in Israel is one of the most important things we have. And you said just a second ago, we did give them an announcement before.
Right.
It is a conflict zone. It is not a one-sided conflict zone. It is a conflict zone because terror comes out of it. It is a conflict zone because people use schools and the AP building and other places, things we would never do.
But what about the funeral on Friday? Israeli police beating mourners with batons. Was that a conflict zone?
In a way, yes. First of all, let me say this. The pictures are horrible. The pictures are horrible. I'm not going to defend the pictures, and we are conducting an investigation. And by the way, in the series of things that we do to try to manage this situation, mistakes happen. We're not perfect. I don't think anybody's perfect. And if we have anything to learn from this, we will learn from this. But again, context. This was a funeral that we were in charge of public safety of. It was coordinated, the police forces with the family of Shireen Abu Alka. And before the funeral started, people came up, tried to take the coffin from the family, tried to run it to a different direction. And the police was there helping the family make sure that what was agreed upon would happen. Then bottles were thrown at police officers. It's very hard to show how these pictures come to life. But when they come to life, they're horrible, I agree.
But about stories sometimes starting in the middle and needing to know the beginning of the story, and that's very important. This must not be the sort of subject that you'd want to be talking about at all.
I'd love to be talking about Israeli food and gefilte fish. You know, that's a subject if I had to choose myself. But I think it is important for the world to report responsibly, and I want to say why. When you talk about anti-Israel sentiment, every time something happens in Israel, no matter what side it happened from, you know, Al Jazeera has 10 journalists that died in the past few years in conflict areas, none of whom were horrible, none of whom were reported as much as this happening in Israel. And people don't understand that when you automatically blame Israel for things that we haven't done, that turns into anti-Semitic attacks at the end of the day and anti-Semitic sentiments in the United States. And we live in New York City. In New York City, anti-Semitic incidents have quadrupled in the last year. And there's a connection because most of the Jewish people have strong feelings toward Israel, see it as their eternal home. And when you attack that, you attack them, and there is a linkage. And that is why we're not asking for any shortcuts. We're not asking for any discounts, but we are asking for honest reporting about things that happen. We are asking for people to wait for a second before they say Israel is in charge of the killing of a reporter. Maybe we are, and if we are, we need to investigate that. Maybe we're not. But when you assume automatically that we are, that comes from a totally different place in your heart.
To your point about the climate, the suspect in Buffalo, this manifesto that was authored, he described himself as an anti-Semite, you know, a racist and anti-Semite. So this climate, it is very, you know, it needs to be seen in totality. Thank you very much for coming in today.
Thank you. It was a pleasure being here.
Up next, a look at the critical role that MAGA media is playing in Tuesday's hotly contested Pennsylvania GOP primaries. Two top journalists join us live from Philly in just a moment. The GOP primary in Pennsylvania reveals so much about the state of the Republican Party writ large. The Senate candidates there have been campaigning all across right-wing TV. We counted at least 19 interviews across Fox and Newsmax just this month. Dr. Mehmet Oz is a favorite of Fox's Sean Hannity. At this point, Hannity has basically been the shadow campaign manager for the Oz campaign. But it's caused a divide inside Fox, with Hannity trying to warn voters against the little-known but late-surging candidate Kathy Barnett, while an hour later, Laura Ingraham promoting Barnett, denouncing the smear campaign against Barnett and defending her. On Saturday, Barnett, who owes much of her fame to Fox, look at her Twitter bio, likened Hannity to a swamp monster trying to, quote, steal the election. But we only know that thanks to an audio recording of Barnett made by a rally-goer and given to CNN's Dan Merica. Crews from CNN, CBS, NBC, and other outlets were barred from attending this rally on Saturday in Bucks County, even though it was billed as a public event that anyone could attend. This was apparently at the direction of the leading GOP candidate for governor in the state, Doug Mastriano. MSNBC's Dasha Burns showed this man in a Paul Revere outfit telling her to step back behind the cones like she was some sort of threat. A threat for wanting to cover a campaign event. When I showed up on the scene in Warminster yesterday, reporters there told me it was basically a base-stoking strategy, right? It was an example of scorn for the media, uniting many Republicans, so that seemed to be the idea by shutting out the press. But I couldn't help but wonder, do these candidates have something to hide? Why did I have to film from so far away? Reporters want to help everyone know who these candidates are. Selena Zito of the Washington Examiner, who would never be mistaken for some liberal activist, tried to ask Barnett for some basic questions. She got blown off. Basic questions like, what's the name of your hometown? And when was she in officer candidate school? But Barnett would not even share details about her military service. It's baffling. Or is it? Let's ask two folks in Pennsylvania who know. Philly Inquirer national opinion columnist Will Bunch, and Holly Otterbein, a national political reporter for Politico. So Holly, you were out there in the rain getting soaked yesterday. I got there late. What the heck happened? Have you ever been shut out of public campaign events before?
Not a public rally like this. I mean, usually candidates want the press to cover their rallies, particularly in the days before a primary. It's very unusual. So what is
this all about, you think? Is this all about stoking hatred of the media?
Look, Doug Mastriano actually live streamed the event on his Facebook page. So we know that he didn't have a problem with getting it out there. I agree with, a lot of the reporters that you said you talked to. While I can't get into the head of, Mastriano, my best guess is, this was a way to pick a fight with national media and rile up the base. And hey, at the same time, it meant that he got to evade questions from the press about, things like the fact that he was at the Capitol on January 6th, that he was subpoenaed by the Congressional Committee investigating the attack, that he's been the face of the movement to overturn the 2020 election in Pennsylvania. He got to evade questions, on those issues, and then also, picking a fight with the national media. It's good for business in the GOP primary.
Right. The only people that suffer are the voters, even if they don't realize it. It's bad for them. But I think the example of Barnett not answering questions from Zito is a crystal clear example of this problem. Will, you just filed an opinion column about this for the Inquirer. Do you view what's happening right now in Pennsylvania? Sorry, that's not the right one. Let's set that off the screen for a minute. Do you view what's happening in Pennsylvania as part of a broader phenomenon? Look at Herschel Walker in Georgia avoiding debates. They're not just dodging reporters, they're also dodging debates. So is this something bigger going on?
Yeah, I think, Brian, we're really seeing an escalation in what started, 7 years ago with Donald Trump and the whole enemies of the people routine. And it started out as, harassment and taunting of journalists. And now, look, we're seeing, these scenes in Warminster yesterday were kind of shocking to see reporters being banned and shut out of these events. And, I think you're right. It's certainly a base riling tactic. But I think it speaks to a real authoritarian turn in the Republican Party. I think Doug Mastriano is running for governor of Pennsylvania as a kind of a strong man. And I think, his war on the press is kind of essential to this strongman persona he's trying to play. This is an anti-democratic candidate for governor, like Holly mentioned.
Are you just playing into their hands when you say this is authoritarian? Isn't that exactly what they want? Is for folks like you to get all riled up about this?
Look, you know, the extreme right turn that the Republican Party is taking is one of the biggest things that's happening in this country right now, and I think, you know, I think the media can't ignore it, and I think the media needs to call it out for what it is and take the consequences. I mean, this campaign needs exposure. Here, this guy is 3 days away from winning the Republican nomination for governor in Pennsylvania, and people in Pennsylvania need to know where this guy stands. They need to know that this guy, Doug Mastriano, is going to appoint a Secretary of State who, like him, is going to subscribe to Donald Trump's big lie, who may not count all of the votes in the 2024 election. I can't think of any time when voters in Pennsylvania needed to be better informed about a candidate than they need to be informed about Doug Mastriano, and that's what he's trying to prevent.
To your point about the importance of this story, the Inquirer's editorial board came out with this editorial. Here's the headline. We wanted to endorse in the GOP primaries this year. We can't. And they say it's simply because these candidates are not operating in the same reality as the editorial board. So left-leaning editorial board cannot pick a candidate. Tell us more about this.
Is it a left-leaning editorial board, or is the problem that we just can't agree on basic facts? I mean,
Usually endorses Democrats. Usually endorses Democrats.
Well, no, but Brian, this is an endorsement among Republicans within a Republican primary, which they traditionally have done, and they could not do that because they made a decision, and I think this was a sound decision, that they wanted to ask these candidates, do you believe that Joe Biden won the 2020 election? And the majority of these candidates would not say yes. And that just made it a non-starter. It's like, why should we bring these people in here if they can't even agree the basic reality that Joe Biden got 70,000 more votes in Pennsylvania than Donald Trump did?
Right. Holly, the other big media angle in this race is the money being spent, or the lack thereof, both in the gubernatorial race in Pennsylvania and in the Senate race. You've got folks who are losing in the ad wars, winning in the polls.
You know, this is one of the biggest parts of this election, one of the biggest stories, I think. It's completely, you know, unusual and defies political logic. You've got Doug Mastriano, who, as of the beginning of the week, had spent less than $300,000 on TV ads. That's practically nothing in a big state like Pennsylvania compared to his opponents who, you know, have been spending millions and millions of dollars. Same thing with Kathy Barnett. She surged into contention with Dr. Oz and David McCormick. She had spent at the beginning of the week about $140,000 on TV, while Oz and McCormick, you know, and their allies have spent record-breaking sums. So what's going on here? I think that this speaks to a few things. The power of right-wing media. You know, both Mastriano and Barnett, while, you know, especially Mastriano has really stayed away from the traditional press. Barnett has done, you know, I think a bit more interaction with it. But nonetheless, they've both really, you know, made a name for themselves on right-wing media. And then also, I think this is a story about social media. On Facebook, you know, they get tons of interactions. You know, there are Facebook groups that are dedicated to them, that are fan groups. And, you know, they're kind of like volunteer armies spreading the message of these candidates. I thought there was an analysis that was really, really telling, which showed that Kathy Barnett only had about 40,000 followers on Facebook. Dr. Oz had 5.6 million. But this analysis showed that they had roughly the same amount of interactions and video views on Facebook. I mean, that is really telling.
That's really interesting. On Tuesday, we're going to see if the polls were right-ish or not. Will and Holly, thank you both. Still ahead, the challenges of covering one of the most divisive and deeply personal issues in society. A reporter who covers abortion rights full-time is going to join us from Texas in just a moment. Now let's take a look at the news media's role in the abortion debate. As leaks from the Supreme Court continue to come out, continue to signal that Roe v. Wade will likely be overturned this summer, it is critical to cover what's happening at the state level as well, at state capitals and at clinics and hospitals. The press should scrutinize the people making the rules, yes, but we should also be centering the voices of the people living under the rules and how their lives may change. Washington Post national political reporter Caroline Kitchener is doing just that. Her entire beat is about the politics of abortion, and she joins us live from Corpus Christi, Texas. Caroline, tell us about where you are and what you've been working on there in Texas.
Thanks so much for having me, Brian. So I'm here in Corpus Christi. I've been spending the week in abortion clinics in San Antonio, and now I'm here spending time in a crisis pregnancy center in Corpus Christi. And I just knew, when the leak happened and we knew that Roe was going to be overturned, I did a few stories from Washington, and then I just really wanted to get on a plane. I wanted to get to the people that were going to be most directly affected by this ruling. And Texas is the place, because Texas has really been living in a post-Roe world since September. Abortions here have been outlawed after 6 weeks of pregnancy, which is before most people know that they're pregnant. So I knew that I wanted to come here.
How do you get women and doctors and activists to open up to you? But really, the women who are debating whether to have abortions or who are going through it, how do you gain their trust to talk to them?
I spend an enormous time thinking about this question. The first step for me is really gaining the trust of the abortion providers, talking to them, going to visit them at a time when abortion is not in the headlines and they're not completely inundated with media requests. They need to trust you. I mean, you go into these clinics and you're asking them to let you talk to people at what is for many one of the most vulnerable times in their lives. So they need to believe and know and trust that you are going to treat that patient with empathy and compassion. And so that's really the first step for me, is building that trust. And then, when I get in the room with a patient, I don't take out my recorder right away. I don't take out my notebook. I just sit there and explain, why I'm there and ask them to tell me what brought them there that day.
We're showing video from the abortion rights rally that you attended yesterday in San Antonio. Do you try to talk to men too? I don't want to give you my whole rant about how this is all, about men actually, because that's ridiculous. But it does take two people to make a baby happen. And I get so frustrated that there's not more accountability on that side of the gender aisle. But anyway, do you try to cover this from different directions in that way?
I absolutely do try to talk to men. And there were a lot of men there yesterday marching through the streets of San Antonio. And it's also typically outside of the abortion clinic, the protesters are almost all men. And I try really hard to engage with them as well.
It's the birds and the bees, right? We showed a headline that you had published. Let's put it back on screen. This was your headline the morning before the political leak happened. So you were already writing about this. You wrote about this for the Post. It was on the front page that night about how anti-abortion activists want to make sure a nationwide ban passes. So you've been out in front on this. Is that where the press should be focused? On this is what's coming. Expect it. Assume it's coming. A nationwide ban.
I mean, I think states are first. Everybody, this is the front line. All of these states, 13 states are going to ban abortion right away when this decision comes down. And all of the people that I talk to on the national level are really adamant about that the focus should be on the states first. But we do know now with this reporting that there are conversations that are happening behind the scenes in Washington. Senators are getting together with leading anti-abortion advocates, and they're talking about the potential for a national ban. Now, I don't think that's going to happen right away, but I do think that we certainly will see proposals for a nationwide abortion ban before the midterms.
And before I let you go, number one point you want to make about the media coverage, what we need to make sure we do right in the days and weeks and months to come.
I think that we need to be on the ground. We need to be in clinics. We need to be in pregnancy centers. This is where the front lines are, and journalists should be here.
Caroline, thank you very much for doing the work. Good to see you.
Thanks for having me.
Still ahead, Elon Musk. He's all thumbs up about the future of Twitter, maybe, but now he says his deal's on hold. Is he really just giving us all the middle finger? We're going to dissect that with Oliver Darcy in just a moment. So, is Elon Musk just trolling us again? This week started with an ominous tweet about Musk dying and ended with the potential death of his Twitter deal. He says his takeover is on hold, blaming bots, but he claims to still be committed to the deal. So what do we make of this? Let's ask Oliver Darcy. He's here with me. We've both been watching this every day. He says he's worried about spam accounts and bots on the site, but he's linking to a 2-week-old article from Reuters. Everybody knew this was a problem. He's acting like he just discovered it. Something's going on. Seems like it's really about the money here, about the money.
I think like a good troll, no one knows exactly whether Elon is being genuine or not, and that's what makes him so effective and provocative. I do think that this is probably, I mean, you got to imagine the Twitter board of directors, and they're trying to get this deal done, and they're probably wondering what in the world is Elon doing. Clearly, it is bothering Twitter to some extent because Elon said over the weekend that they had sent a notice that he had broken NDA when he was talking about the sample size for determining trolls. So
I missed that. Did he tweet about that?
He did. He's tweeting about a lot, Brian.
Okay,
You gotta,
so, but Twitter sent him an NDA, so that is significant.
Yeah, so it's clearly bothering Twitter, his antics, but I'm not really sure what they can do about it, right? He's theoretically going to own the company soon.
They don't have another buyer waiting in the wings. They don't have anybody else that really wants to buy it. All right, hard turn but important. Today's New York Times front page has to be seen. This is basically a 2-page front page showing the entire United States, marking 1 million deaths from COVID-19. This is breathtaking, Oliver, to see this front page. We'll put it up in a sec. To show every individual black dot as a person who passed away. And it shows, as much as some people might want to forget about COVID, it must be remembered.
Yeah, and I think this headline really captures it because it is immeasurable how many people have died and suffered because of the virus. And I think as we do return to normalcy, or at least a more normal world, it is important to reflect and remember those people. And it's really impossible, but the New York Times is doing a pretty good job, I think, highlighting it on the front page and saying, really, that this is immeasurable. We can't even do it ourselves.
Immeasurable.
Yeah.
Another hard turn, but at least something a little bit amusing. Tom Brady going to Fox Sports, announcing he's going to be joining Fox Sports after he retires from playing football. And this is possibly the biggest deal for a television announcer ever in history.
And he's not even a television announcer, right? He has no history announcing sports. But listen, this is a great coup for Fox. Right now, he's going to be the face of Fox Sports. He's the best quarterback. You know, whether you like him or not, he's the best of all time. And so I think, you know, this is going to really gin up a lot of interest in Fox Sports and him calling the games, and it's going to be a good deal for them. And in the large scheme of things, you have to keep in mind the NFL is $1 billion industry. They're paying him about $37 million a year. So while it's a lot, you know, I think Fox can afford it.
It's actually in line with what makes sense given how valuable football is to television broadcasters. Oliver, thank you very much. Check out our nightly newsletter. For more on all this, sign up for free at reliablesources.com. And we'll see you right back here this time next week.
City survive a massive scare as the Hammers revive the Premier League title race. How a former fan prolonged the playoff agony for the Toronto Maple Leafs, and why no one seems to be able to stop the top-ranked player in women's tennis right now. Hello, welcome to CNN World Sport. I'm Alex Thomas in London. West Ham has breathed new life into the English Premier League title race, holding Manchester City to a draw and in fact almost beating them. A win for City at the London Stadium earlier on Sunday could have all but ended Liverpool's hopes of catching them at the top of the table. Instead, a double strike from Jarrod Bowen left Pep Guardiola's team rocking like a dazed boxer in the ring. Second half with Jack Grealish's first Premier League goal of the year, before a West Ham own goal from a Riyad Mahrez free kick put the scores level at 2-2. Mahrez then had a chance to win it for City from the penalty spot in the dying minutes, but his shot was saved. It means, so this is how the top of the Premier League table looks. If Liverpool win at Southampton on Tuesday, then they'll be just 1 point behind with 1 match to go for both those top two sides. City's fate still in their own hands, but it's nowhere near as comfortable as it once was. Our senior sports analyst, Darren Lewis, watching that game at the London Stadium and joins us now. Darren, it looks thrilling from our point of view, watching the telly. What was it like to actually be there?
Alex, it was epic. Nerve-shredding, edge-of-the-seat tension from the moment West Ham took that shock 2-0 lead in the first half. For so many people, Alex, this looked like being a certainty on paper for West Ham, but bear in mind, West Ham put City out of the League Cup in October, and they've got their own ambitions of playing in Europe next season by virtue of their league position. So they needed at least a point from today's game, and they got it. It was a fantastic match, fantastic drama, and a result that means, as you've been suggesting, the race for the Premier League title will go down to the final day in a week's time.
How gutsy a comeback was that from City? Because they looked like they were out of ideas in the first half at times.
Yeah, they did indeed. To be honest with you, we're all sitting in a press box wondering what they were going to do, because at the break, as you were saying, they found themselves behind by 2 goals. Now, there have been 52 occasions where they've been behind at half-time by 2 goals or more, and they had never come back to win on those previous occasions. And watching that comeback today, it really did look for a long time as though they would break that run. So Riyad Mahrez will have nightmares over that missed penalty. Infamous slip cost Liverpool the title in 2014. Remember, they could have won it. He slipped, allowed Chelsea to score and deny them the title. Well, he could be the man who wins it for them this time around if his Aston Villa team can stop City from winning next Sunday. Villa being beaten in just 1 of their last 5 matches. Having said that, I've got to just read you this from Pep Guardiola, because he said, look, I can assure you of something. This is Pep speaking just after the match today. I can assure you something. In 1 week, our stadium, he says, will be so loud, and we will give them our lives, and they will give us all their lives. He's referring to his players for 90 minutes. He says it will be an incredible privilege to win 1 game and home and be champions. So whatever happens this time next Sunday could be an epic occasion.
Of course, it needs Liverpool to set it up by winning against Southampton on Tuesday, really having to summon their energy again after a busy week.
Yes, indeed. I mean, they're the newly crowned FA Cup champions. They beat Chelsea on Saturday. They're going to need to win both of their remaining games at Southampton on Tuesday night and at home to Wolves a week today. But today's result means, as I said, one of the most compelling title races in Premier League history. It will go down to the wire, Alex.
Fantastic stuff. And Darren, stay with us. Sunday's early kickoff in the Premier League saw Tottenham beat relegation-threatened Burnley 1-0. The only goal of the game coming from the penalty spot. That was deep into added time at the end of the first half. Harry Kane scoring it to clinch a crucial 3 points for Tottenham as they look to win Champions League football next season. Let's remind you of what the top of the Premier League table looks like. Look a bit further beyond Man City and Liverpool. You can see that Tottenham have leapfrogged their North London rivals Arsenal to get back into 4th spot. But the Gunners have a game in hand. They play it on Monday night. And Darren, I guess, massive pressure on Mikel Arteta and his men now, having lost to Spurs in that North London derby, now seeing them go above them in the table, knowing they can't afford any more slip-ups?
Absolutely. The game on Monday night, I cannot stress how tense it will be. I think as far as Spurs are concerned, they've done their job. They've beaten Burnley today, and that victory means that they go into fourth place. As far as Arsenal are concerned, the pressure now is all on them to beat a team who are undefeated. I should say they've lost just once, and that was against Liverpool since the turn of the year. That's 5 months. They've not managed to lose to any other team but Liverpool in front of their own fans. Arsenal got a win there. No, a draw will not be good enough, because if they draw, then Spurs will go on to complete a Champions League place, fourth place, if they were to take all 3 points at Norwich next Sunday. And bear in mind, Norwich have conceded 38 goals in their 18 games in front of their own fans so far this season. So it should be fairly straightforward for a forward line of Harry Kane and Son Heung-min. Big pressure on Arsenal tomorrow night. The drama continues.
I feel like we're going to have a few more conversations over the next few days, Darren, about this. It could be very, very interesting. Darren Lewis, as ever, really appreciate your time. So City being held to a draw, more good news for Liverpool. As Darren said, just 24 hours after they secured their second major trophy of the season as part of that quest for an unprecedented quadruple. Unbelievably, Liverpool's FA Cup triumph at Wembley on Saturday, their first in the competition since 2006. A goalless but eventful match decided by a nail-biting penalty shootout after extra time. Liverpool's Senegalese star Sadio Mane with a chance to win, but his spot kick saved by his international teammate Edward Mendy. Chelsea surviving, but on the back foot again when Mason Mount stepped up shortly afterwards and couldn't beat Alisson. With the next kick, Liverpool's Greek defender Kostas Tsimikas settling it, sparking scenes of wild celebration. As we said, Liverpool's dream of a quadruple still alive. Only 3 games left to play for Jurgen Klopp and his men. They've completed a domestic cup double. They'll play for the Champions League trophy against Real Madrid in Paris in 2 weeks' time. Between then and now, they're hoping that Aston Villa can help them as they try to overtake Manchester City at the top of the Premier League, the only part of the quadruple that is not in their hands. The big question in women's tennis remains, can anyone stop Iga Świątek, the 20-year-old Pole, doing things only Serena Williams has done before? Hello again, World Sports back with the only other close title race in Europe's Big Five leagues. Italy's Serie A, AC Milan trying to become champions for the first time in more than a decade. They're hoping to hold off city rivals Internazionale, who are 2 points adrift and looking to defend the title they won last year. Milan have kicked off against Atalanta in the last 10 minutes, goalless currently. If they win, it piles the pressure on Inter for their game later on Sunday. Defeat and the Scudetto will be in Milan's hands. Who better to hear from when it comes to all things Milan than a player who won the Serie A title with the Rossoneri in 1998-99, revered former striker Oliver Bierhoff. Our own Patrick Snell recently speaking with the former Germany captain turned national team director who helped the San Siro Giants overcome Lazio that season. Bierhoff scoring 19 goals, including a hat-trick in the penultimate match, his team winning their last 7 in a row to clinch the title. And this is what he thinks of the current crop of Milan stars.
We are seeing a very exciting Serie A title race, the most exciting in decades so far this season. What do you make of it all?
Well, supporting Milan and hoping that they finally get the championship again. It's good for the tournament. It's good for the city of Milan that you have this competition amongst the both teams. But I would be very, very happy also for Paolo Maldini, with whom I played. A great guy. To have the success and to bring back the championship.
Yeah, well, you know what it's like to winning the Serie A crown, Scudetto, with them. Look at their current squad, because so often now we talk about the power of money in today's game. We talk about wealthy owners. But you look at their recruitment process and the development of young players. How impressive is that, do you feel?
Well, it's very impressive also what Pioli did with his team, and he also included older players who became very decisive, like Oliver Giroud. So you can see that finding the right players, also like atmosphere-wise, mental-wise, it's very important. But you see, of course, in certain moments also the lack of, I wouldn't say quality, but experience and also continuity in the team. So you never know what will happen, and they are not so perhaps constant like the big teams. And perhaps for this year also for the Italian championship, that's very good. But Milan has to think bigger, and they have to think international wise, and the competition in the Champions League is much harder.
And as I say, you know what it's like to live there and be successful with them. What would a title win mean to the people of Milan AC, the Rossoneri, to their fans there?
Yeah, hope and a certain also strength for the upcoming season then, and for sure also for Paolo Maldini more opportunities to buy players. And besides the financial aspect is also for other players interesting to coming back to Milano to Milan, because you now see that it's a successful team.
German football legend Oliver Bierhoff speaking to Patrick Snell about why he's cheering on AC Milan in that Serie A title race. Let's cross the Atlantic to catch up on the latest action in the NHL playoffs. And the Toronto Maple Leafs failed to end a long-running curse when it comes to crunch game sevens. Our own Coy Wire can explain why they were made to pay by a former fan.
Alex, win or go home game sevens in playoff hockey brings out some of the most intense emotion in sports, especially for Toronto Maple Leafs fans, a sea of humanity outside their arena. The Leafs had lost 9 straight win or go home playoff games, the longest streak in hockey, NBA, and MLB, hoping to break the curse against the 2-time defending champion Lightning, but they're burned by one of their own. 27-year-old Nick Paul from Toronto has the game of his life. He'd never played in a playoff game until this year, never scored a playoff goal, but he nets 2 of them against the team he used to go to watch as a kid. They were Tampa's only 2 goals of the game, the Lightning moving on to face the Panthers in a battle for Florida and a rematch of last year's playoffs, as hearts are breaking all over Toronto yet again. To Carolina, where Hurricanes fans had their place rocking for their must-win game against Boston. The Bruins have won 15 Game 7s, tied for the most in NHL history, but the Canes' Max Domi dominates. just like Nick Paul. Get this, he'd never scored a playoff goal either until Saturday, but he too scores 2 of them. And listen to this, they grew up together in Toronto and they'd go to games together. Bruins had a shot to tie it in the final seconds. Canes goalie Antti Raanta calling it the longest 20 seconds of his life as they tried to hold Boston at bay, and they do. Carolina clutch. They've now won 6 straight Game 7 situations, Alex. And after the game, Ranta's press conference is interrupted when a fan rushes the podium. His 5-year-old daughter, Evelyn, the Finnish goalie, and the Canes advancing to face the winner of the Penguins-Rangers series. Now to the Oilers-Kings Game 7. And Connor McDavid showing why he's arguably the best hockey player on the planet. The Oilers superstar, too fast, too strong. Look at this magic. Seems like he's got the entire defense smothering him, but he Houdinis his way around, through, and right up over him for the goal. Edmonton wins 2-0. The reigning league MVP, 4 goals and 10 assists against the Kings. That's tied for the most points in a single playoff series by any player in 28 years. The incredible weekend of Game 7s continues, Alex. 4 more on Sunday, 2 hockey, 2 NBA, and a huge day for fans in Dallas. First city ever to have 2 teams playing in Game 7s on the same day. The Dallas Stars taking on the Calgary Flames, while their Mavericks, led by Serbian star Luka Doncic, taking on the Phoenix Suns. The Mavs fought back to force this elimination game with stifling defense, handing the Suns season lows and scoring twice in this series. But the Suns and future Hall of Famer Chris Paul and young gun Devin Booker seem to have the advantage. The home team has won every game this series, and historically, home teams have won Game 7s about 80% of the time. The Suns hoping for a second straight conference finals appearance.
I think just the comfortability of, playing 42 games here rather than 2 on the road, and just playing in front of our fans. I'm sure it's going to be rowdy in there. It's going to be excited. It's going to be a lot of energy. So, I'm looking forward to it.
And the Boston Celtics taking on the defending champion Milwaukee Bucks in a clash of titans. Reigning Finals MVP Giannis Antetokounmpo of the Bucks scoring 44 points in their last game, while Boston's 24-year-old phenom Jason Tatum scored 46. You'd think that the Celtics, one of the most storied franchises in all the sports with one of the most passionate fan bases, would have the clear advantage playing at home. But road teams have won 4 of 6 games in this series. Even the players know just how special these Game 7s are.
Good old Game 7. Beautiful. You just gotta go enjoy the game. You don't know if you're ever gonna be a part of a Game 7. I just talked with Wes. If you've ever been a part of a Game 7, he played in the league for more than a decade. He's never been a part of the Game 7. So never take it for granted. Enjoy the game. Go out there and try to play good basketball. Hopefully we can put ourselves in a position to win.
All right, Alex, I'll echo what both Giannis and Devin Booker said. Game 7, best 2 words in sports. It's what the players want to play in, and it's what the fans want to watch.
Coy wire with some terrific NBA and NHL action, and also looking sartorially as elegant as ever, making me feel like a scruff bag. Now some sad news, and it's already been a horrific year for Australian cricket with the deaths of legendary former players Rod Marsh and Shane Warne not too long ago, and now more tragedy has struck after Andrew Symonds was killed in a car crash. He was only 46. Queensland police say it doesn't look as if any other vehicle was involved. Symonds found in his car after it came off the road and rolled over just west of Townsville. That's in the northeast of Australia. Emergency services couldn't revive him. Symonds, a hugely popular, larger-than-life character who, at the peak of his career, was a powerful and game-changing all-rounder with bat and ball, played for Australia in all forms of cricket between 1998 to 2009, winning 2 World Cups and an Ashes series. Many stars of the sport have paid tribute to Symonds, including former Aussie wicket-keeping all-rounder Adam Gilchrist, who said, "Simply stunned. I can't believe we're in this space again in the cricketing world." World Sports is back in just a moment. Welcome back to World Sport. Iga Świątek's dominance of women's tennis continues. She's beaten Ons Jabeur in the final of the Italian Open in Rome to extend her winning streak to 28 matches. Her opponent earlier on Sunday, also a history maker, having become the first Arab and African woman to win a WTA 1000 title. That was in Madrid last week. But despite holding a winning record over Świątek, she couldn't live with the Poles' fearsome form right now. The final score 6-2, 6-2. So that's 5 straight tournaments for Świątek dating back to February. 4 of those being WTA 1000 events. That's the highest level of event outside of the 4 majors. The 20-year-old Pole, just the second player ever to win 4 or more of those in a single season. The only other person to do it, Serena Williams, who won 5 back in 2013. Novak Djokovic hasn't played much tennis this season, but he's managed to hit his stride just in time for next week's French Open. With his quarter-final win at the Italian Open on Friday, he guaranteed he'll still be the #1 seed come Paris. And on Saturday, he banked the 1,000th win of his career. Then on Sunday, his first title of the year, winning that Italian Open in Rome. He was up against the Greek superstar, Stefanos Tsitsipas, in the final. The world #1 coming out red-hot, storming to a 6-love win in the first set. The second set a lot more competitive. It went to a tie-break. Djokovic still emerging victorious. In fact, he didn't drop a set the entire tournament. 6 titles in Rome for the Serb, who heads to Roland Garros now as one of the favourites. OK, we're about to show you how Borussia Dortmund bade farewell to Erling Haaland and why Stuttgart fans were made to wait before going wild with joy. When footballers leave clubs, it can get acrimonious, but Erling Haaland doesn't appear to have burnt any bridges, judging from the generous farewell he was given on the final day of the Bundesliga season. Borussia Dortmund's famous yellow wall of fans chanting his name as he was honoured before the club kicked off against Hertha Berlin. Haaland then signing off in style before his move to Manchester City next season by scoring a second-half penalty. Dortmund winning, it was of little consequence. They were already guaranteed second place. However, it does put Berlin into a relegation playoff because of what happened elsewhere. Take a look at Stuttgart, who were playing for their Bundesliga lives against Cologne. Stuttgart fans, it means no relegation for them. They have survived. They'll be in the Bundesliga again next season. Absolutely stunning pictures. Who can blame them for getting that excited? That's all you World Sport for now. I'll be back in 4.5 hours' time with the result of the Women's FA Cup final. Hope to see you then. Goodbye.
South Africa is home to a world-renowned wine industry, one that is undergoing a transformation. But it faces challenges.
There's not a single grape growing region of the world where this virus is not a problem.
Today, some are seeking inventive solutions.
Embracing new technologies is what is going to drive the industry and research forward.
Others are reviving centuries-old traditions.
We are very proud of the ducks. That's why we take care of them, and also they take care of us in the vineyards.
And many are striving for a cleaner future.
We're chasing long-term goals, which obviously got to incorporate all the sustainability issues that we possibly can.
And together, they're embracing innovation.
I think science and technology have helped us to face the challenges like something like climate change or producing better vineyards to get better grapes to make a better wine.
These are the enthusiasts changing the face of South Africa's wine industry. This is Inside Africa. South Africa, although categorized as a so-called New World wine country, has been producing extraordinary wines since the 17th century. In Stellenbosch, a traditional home of the wine industry, researchers at the university's agri-science facility are studying the science behind the wine.
Research and industry is coming together to look at vineyard health, soil quality, grapevine health, looking at water stress levels, how grapevines respond to that, from what is happening in the vineyard to what the quality of wine that goes in the bottle looks like and tastes like.
Professor Evodia Setati is a senior researcher with the university's Department of Viticulture and Enology, and much of her work involves microorganisms.
They're the most fascinating thing because you can't see them with your naked eye, and just understanding the power of microorganisms for me is the most exciting thing.
She, her colleagues, and their students are also trying to understand the effects of climate change on vineyards and the grapes they produce.
The vineyard ecosystem is influenced by environmental factors, and we've had so many rounds of heat waves, and that has an impact on the ripening process. Climate change is one of the biggest threats, and so that means that we have to look at more drought-resistant crops. We have a big trilateral program between South Africa, China, and Belgium to use models to start looking at whether we can predict what will happen and how we can mitigate against that.
On the slopes of the Paardeberg Mountain outside the town of Wellington, a wine estate with a 3 centuries-old winemaking tradition is doing all it can to protect botanical diversity and to combat climate change.
We look at every single aspect of what we do. We've got solar, we do alien vegetation clearing for water retention, we manage our effluent very, very carefully and then use that for irrigation again, so we use our water twice.
They are also constantly evaluating the results of their initiatives.
It's very hard to innovate on a traditional based product that is literally thousands of years old. But what we have now is lots and lots of data. So we can see what is working and why it is working, and we can look at aspects and be very critical about them and say, right, we're going to do this differently.
Their projects have earned them long-standing membership of the Worldwide Fund for Nature's Conservation Champion Program.
Where we are is special and unique. So in order to celebrate our environment, we've named 2 of our top wines after flowers that are endemic to the Paardeberg area.
Outside Cape Town, another conservation-minded winery is using an ancient approach to keep its vineyards free of pests.
I call our ducks the soldiers of our vineyards because they are the protectors of the vineyards.
Runner ducks have been used in Asia for hundreds of years to remove pests from rice paddies.
We currently have 1,600 ducks. As they herd through the vineyards, they will pick up the snails and the small insects. And in a cycle of 14 days, they will be going through the farm and actually keeping all the pests under control.
They help us in the vineyards to control all the pests. So the ducks are our favorite on the farm.
Soon, the next generation of these ducks may well be patrolling nearby wine estates.
We intend to actually farm with them in such a way and actually breed them that they can be sold off to other farms in the industry so that we can broaden our sustainability footprint and lower our carbon footprint.
Some of their eggs also find their way into the kitchen at a new restaurant recently opened by one of South Africa's most acclaimed chefs in a truly unique location on the estate.
In the case of Clara's barn at Vergenoegd, it was definitely heritage and history that stood at the forefront. The farm is historically significant. It's the oldest standing barn in the Western Cape. So for us to be able to operate a restaurant in that space is incredible.
For Bertus Besson, the South African wine industry is a source not only of quality wines, but also of inspiration.
The wine industry and the food industry in South Africa go hand in hand. If it wasn't for the wine industry, the restaurant industry wouldn't have developed as well as what it has in South Africa, and I think vice versa.
It's an industry that winemaker Vusi Dalituba never imagined he'd be part of, and credits his father, who worked at a nearby brewing company, for planting the seed.
He was just a general worker, and he will used to come back with wines at home. And then by that's what got interested in me. And I eventually joined CPUT in Wellington, and I did viticulture and oenology. And then I've never left it. It's been my number one. The thing that is special for me at Vergenoegd is the heritage of the farm. This is one of the oldest farms in South Africa, and the people on the farm. And also, lastly but not the least, is the sustainability of the farm.
In the small town of Paarl in the Western Cape province of South Africa, there's a non-profit organization providing specialized products and services to help the wine industry grow and evolve, from the ground to the glass.
Winpro has got 2,700 members. They include the grape growers or the producers, wineries and other value chain players. We offer various products and services, very technical services, and then a big part of our life is knowledge transfer, information sharing, keeping our members up to date with the latest trends, forecasts and information.
They also provide programs to connect growers to new scientific discoveries and innovative technologies.
And within that would be flagship projects, which are things like water efficiency, waste efficiency, how do we manage climate to make sure that we stay ahead of the curve.
It is also home to the Wine Arc, a business unit taking sustainable transformation of the wine industry forward through career development programs, land reform initiatives, and by supporting Black-owned wineries.
This concept of a wine arc as a communal or unified place was really something new.
In December 2021, the Wine Arc opened its doors as a brand home for Black-owned wine businesses.
So I came to visit this facility in 2015 and I saw the potential. So when you stand on this deck of ours and you overlook Stellenbosch, it says the authentic story of Stellenbosch, our authentic diversified cultures all coming together and being part of this unique industry.
For Stellenbosch winemaker Carmen Stevens, the launch of the Wine Arc is a welcome initiative.
It's the first home or brand home for Black-owned brands in South Africa. It's giving us that space where people can come sit down and enjoy our wines. It is such a fantastic initiative and it shows our heritage. It shows where we as Black-owned brands are coming from.
Her own journey has not been without its challenges.
Winemaking was open to white South Africans only. When I got into the industry, the challenge was to prove that I'm capable of making wine, capable of making decisions, capable of standing my ground.
And determination is only a part of her hands-on approach.
The success of my wines, I think, definitely lies in working with amazing fruits. I work with really great growers. And then my team, and you know, we work, I say that each and every bottle of our wines carry our fingerprint.
Carmen is also active outside the wine industry through her namesake foundation and a program begun more than 10 years ago.
There was a big need for food, especially kids at school that don't have anything to eat during school or when they get home. A lot of these parents are either farm workers or work in factories. My own mother worked in a factory. So I knew there was a challenge in terms of food for these kids. Today, we feed over 25,000 learners in 125 schools, a breakfast and a lunch.
And without her winemaking and the success of her business, none of this would be possible.
This product that we work with every day, that I put so much of myself, my passion, my time in, is this product that is making my foundation possible. And that for me is the highlight, that it actually contributed to enhancing or developing the communities where I'm coming from. That for me is my pride and my joy.
South Africa's winelands, as they're known, are among the most beautiful wine-producing regions in the world. But sometimes that beauty can be deceptive. Outside Wellington, in South Africa's Western Cape province, a family of scientists is developing strategies to fight one of the biggest threats to the wine industry worldwide.
It's beautiful, the symptom itself. It looks like the vineyards are completely on fire, and that's an indication of how widespread this virus actually occurs. And what very few people know is the terrible effect that it actually has on the wine and the grape quality.
At the Patho Solutions Laboratory, Professor Gerard Peterson works alongside his son and daughter, studying the virus behind leaf roll disease.
The virus produces almost like a blockage in the nutrient system of the plant. So you get all the kind of physiological effects that such a blocking would cause. The leaf turns this red color. The grapes themselves start growing very unevenly. They get ripe at different times of the year. They don't produce the colors they need. They don't produce the sugars that you need for wine production.
But it's not all about time spent in the lab.
That kind of work is theoretical until it actually gets applied somewhere.
Andre van Rensburg was one winemaker who embraced the professor's recommendations at one of South Africa's oldest, most prestigious and award-winning wine estates.
Now, Vergelegen was founded in 1700 by the then governor at the Cape, Willem Adrian van der Stel. And as he knew the fine estates of Europe, he had a very simple goal. He wanted to establish Vergelegen as one of the great wine estates of the world.
Today, after 25 years here, van Rensburg is still pursuing that goal.
The hypothesis is that older vineyards make better wine. For me, it has always been the challenge to make wine from vineyards older than 20 years. But how do you get rid of leaf roll virus? And that has always been the great challenge for us. Your vineyards don't really get older than 15 to 20 years. And if they get to 20 years, they're sick. And the sick person or athlete or plant can't compete with a healthy one. Get rid of leaf roll virus, then we can see how great South Africa can be with healthy vineyards.
Today, Professor Peterson has returned to Creation Wines, voted number 10 in the 2021 World's Best Vineyards and number 1 in Africa. They too have embraced his clean vine philosophy.
Having had them as partners really made the control of the disease practical. Other growers could see that it actually works. The first step in controlling this disease is to start off with clean planting material that has been put through 2 techniques which eliminate the virus, and then from there on these plants are propagated.
Once nurseries have grown healthy young vines, they are ideally planted in virgin soil to create a perfect clean system.
And as an exchange, then they would be able to come and cut in the winter the prunings that they can regrafting new plants virus-free. So for us it was just a win-win. So we basically gave our farm a little bit as the guinea pig.
It's a collaboration that, according to Creation's viticulturalist, has paid dividends.
So it was virgin soil, so there wasn't any viruses in the ground or any other problems, so they could choose where to plant specific cultivars, so they could plan it perfectly from the start. With Professor Peterson to take it to the next level, to teach us what to do and what not to do, to give us advice. We are lucky to have 99.9% virus-free vines on the farm.
The team continues to work with Vititech, the organization which supplied them with the virus-free vines 20 years ago.
We not want to pull out the vineyards after 20 years. We want to carry over to 40, 50 years and maybe just replace the plants who dies and just replanting youngs into the older vineyards. So it was for us a no-brainer.
If you give the winemaker bad grapes, you cannot make good wine. So our challenge is to always give the best grapes so that they can make the best wine.
More you're taking a kind of a minimalistic intervention approach. When the quality of grapes comes to your cellar door, you really doesn't want to fiddle too much around and really take nature this path to get to the end product. Be close to nature in winemaking, and most of the times you get rewarded quite nicely.
This is Hemel en Aarde, which translates as heaven and earth, an area where some of the finest wines in South Africa are made. The region's wine history is relatively short, but it was in the mid-1970s that it began producing the wine it's renowned for today.
This property was purchased in 1975 by Tim Hamilton Russell, who then planted different varieties of grapes. And since then, the whole sort of Hemel en Aarde area has developed and blossomed into what it is today. The wines don't make themselves, but we try and do as little as possible so that we actually get a very nice vintage expression and showcase Hamilton Russell in that vintage.
Nearby boutique vineyard Bouchard Finlayson is a popular stop on wine tours to the area, and has spent more than 30 years building its global reputation.
I think the wines are true to place, and I think a lot of people recognize that they can feel the climate, they can see it in the wines. And then the other thing is consistency. If you can produce wines consistently well, it also helps to promote a wine in the long run.
One of the relative newcomers to the area, the Newton Johnson family vineyard, were established with a clear goal.
We moved here from Stellenbosch 25 years ago, looking to pursue Pinot Noir. We're a family-owned property, and basically with that, looking to try and pursue what we feel the best of Pinot Noir to come out of South Africa. The philosophy here is basically sustainable, less intervention, and basically looking for something that we feel expresses where we are more so than what we are.
In 2019, this region was added to the UNESCO Creative Cities list for its gastronomy.
Our region is really famous for Chardonnay and Pinot Noir. Some people call it the little Burgundy, and it is really fantastic. I think what grows together goes together, and for me it's about this incredible pristine environment that we have, and it's about marrying those local products which are so beautiful.
Scientist Emma Karkierk works across South Africa's wine-growing regions, creating so-called demo sites with a team of viticulturalists. Today, she's here to discuss a new project.
We are going to be planting 14 Chardonnay clones on one rootstock, and the idea with this demo is to just evaluate what clones work better at this site, which ones produce the better wines. Ultimately, that will be a long-term part of this project, will be to make wines from each different clone.
This forms part of the Gen Z Vineyard project, which connects growers to new technologies.
It aims to empower the wine growers to make informed decisions when it comes to their vineyard management practices, as well as to provide the growers with site-relevant or locally relevant information about rootstocks, cultivars and clones and how they perform on different sites.
Let's say we have an open field to plant. Normally we make holes at different parts of the block to take soil samples. And with that sample that we take, we send it into a laboratory, and then they do analysis for us on the soil.
A big part of what we do is looking at suitability of sites. So what cultivars and what rootstock cultivar combinations work the best. Where water scarcity is a challenge, then you may like to choose a cultivar or a rootstock that is a bit more drought tolerant.
Winemakers here are spared many of the water constraints that have become increasingly common across the subcontinent.
The Hemel en Aarde is a really fantastic place. It's one of the most biodiverse wine regions in the world. You can see these incredible mountains that surround us, and the biome is so important to have healthy plants and to have a great vineyard. And the other thing is that we've got this wonderful cool climate. So the ocean is very close to us. It's about 7.5 kilometers away, and we have this huge mountain behind me, which is 100 meters higher than Table Mountain. Get this incredible orographic precipitation which happens because of the mountain, and also these lovely sea breezes that come in off the ocean.
And while the area is blessed with an excellent climate for winemaking, sometimes the weather doesn't cooperate.
I think the biggest challenge is the weather, because you cannot control that. You can control what you need to do every day because you can plan, but you cannot control the weather. So weather is always a challenge because we don't have control, but through the years you also learn how to cope with it and you don't worry about the things that you cannot control.
While these winemakers are all pursuing their own blend, balancing science and tradition, together they're a community emerging as a cornerstone of the South African wine industry.
We've got a very nice community of people in the Hemel and Aarde. We generally get along. Obviously, you don't have to be best friends with everyone, but if somebody needs help, the help comes quite quickly, which is fantastic.
The interaction and the cooperation is really tangible, and I think everybody understands that what is good for one is good for all.
It's been exciting to see how many visitors we have coming to visit us, and let's face it, isn't it great to sit at a table, have a great glass of wine with a beautiful plate of food with your friends around you? I mean, what could be better? And we need to bring joy to this world. That's what we're here to do.